organized. Okay, we're live.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This Saturday, we have a very exciting topic, which I think is relevant. We're going to discuss Assata Shakur's search for revolutionary truth and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Birmingham movement, which we built on last week, a discussion that Doc introduced about the significance of the Birmingham movement of 1963, and also what it would mean to see Philadelphia as a 21st century Birmingham. But I did also want to just welcome Sister Tuera.
Yes.
And sorry, Sister Tuera. We're so happy for you to join us this week. And after we begin the opening discussion led by Doc, we're really excited to have Michelle and Albert back from China as well. And they'll give a little bit of what their experience was like in going to China. And we'll be able to have a discussion also based upon your experiences there over the past 2 weeks. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Montero.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning to everybody. Tyra?
Tuera.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I want to start by talking about Assata Shakur. And in the course of it, I want to talk about a meeting that we had, and I want to draw certain conclusions from that. As you know, Assata died a few weeks ago, and she's one of the best known revolutionaries of the 1960s and 70s. She died in Cuba, where she had sought refuge from American authorities, and the Cuban government protected her for over 35 years. But there are many Assatas. There's the Assata of the young people who have read her autobiography, and many of whom say that her autobiography significantly changed their lives. What they, I think, draw from the autobiography is that she is a courageous person who, along with her comrades and others, carried out this daring break out of Clinton Women's Prison in New Jersey in 1978. They also see a very ordinary Black woman who grew up like so many people do, with a mother, father, listening to certain music and so on. So she has a particular appeal for young people. Then there are former members of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army who knew her then in the New York chapter. And among that group, there is a split, and this split was manifested in how people from that group looked at the memorial that was held for her at Riverside Church last week. In particular, one, Dhoruba Ben Wahid, member of the Black Panther Party, then the Black Liberation Army, felt that the memorial obscured her revolutionary essence. And his claim is that she remained a Black Liberation Army soldier to the very end. I will contest that. Then there are people who regularly go to Cuba, who have this really a love affair with Cuba, and at least two of them I know well, Mealy and Sam Anderson, Rosemary Mealy and Sam Anderson, both of whom I know very well. In fact, Sam and I were roommates at Lincoln University. So we're always in and out of Cuba. I'm certain they're regularly meeting with Assata on a social basis, not necessarily politically. But then there's Angela Davis and Assata. And this is a particularly interesting connection. Angela spoke at the memorial for Assata, interestingly alongside of Martin Hill. I don't know how that hookup was established, but nonetheless, Angela and Assata are two of the most heroic women of the period of the 60s and 70s going forward. So there's something special, if not between them, at least in the public mind. The great Angela Davis and the great Assata Shakur. And I would have to say that in terms of Assata's public political life in this country, it was very short. I would say most of her life she lived in Cuba. And at the time where she may have arisen as a public political force like Angela, she was already in the Black Liberation Army, which was underground and guerrilla warfare, and robbing banks, mainly robbing banks. I'll come back to that. And then captured, about 5 years in prison, and then the breakout, and then in Cuba. So most people have never heard her voice, have never seen her in person, and rely upon either her autobiography or her friends and associates of all different stripes who would go to Cuba and meet with her. Now, before I go any further, I have to say most of them have obscured her development and growth. Just in the way that the Angela Davis that spoke at her memorial last week is not the Angela Davis of the 1970s. I can tell you that you can rest assured that I know what I'm talking about, and that having known her and knowing her, you know, a great courageous woman, but she's not the same person. And certainly Assata is not the same woman who went to prison in 1973, who was almost killed on the New Jersey Turnpike and who escaped in 1978. I'm going to explain that. But now that she is dead, her legend, her reputation will probably grow, because there'll be every type of academic and other kinds of interpretations of her life. Those people who were members of the Black Liberation Army will, I think, exaggerate the Black Liberation Army and use her as a justification for their current and past politics. But she will be, I think, more popular in death than in life. I'm going to, in a lot of ways, attempt, and this is based upon very limited exposure to her, but even that exposure, I think, is very valuable. And when I get to that, I hope to explain what exactly I mean. But I'm interested in her political and ideological life, her growth and development. And I say again, she did not remain the same person. And frankly, she almost put it like that to me when we met. First of all, where did the Black Liberation Army come from? The Black Liberation Army was an offshoot or the result of a split within the Black Panther Party between the East and West Coast, between Huey Newton's Black Panther Party on the West Coast and Elbridge Cleaver, who was not on the East Coast, in fact, was not in the country, pretty much in Algeria. Elbridge Cleaver's claim that Huey Newton's position that the Panther Party could not be identified with the gun. It had to be identified based upon its service to the people. And therefore, he was calling for a political party rather than a armed guerrilla movement. Elbridge Cleaver and the others in his group, mainly in New York, said that we were on the cusp of a revolution and therefore we needed an armed attack upon the state. Huey would end up expelling Cleaver and others from the Black Panther Party. And I think in response, they abandoned the Black Panther Party and formed the Black Liberation Army. However, things similar to this were going on in many advanced capitalist countries. For example, in Germany, there was a similar underground military organization called the Red Army Faction, I think. In France, there was a similar organization. These all grew out of the student movement in Europe, and particularly in Paris in 1968. The conclusion that they drew was that in Europe, this is in Germany, France, Italy, Greece, was that the traditional Marxist notion of the class struggle had exhausted its usefulness, and that what was called for was an armed assault upon the state by groups of heavily armed militants and revolutionaries. The Black Liberation Army, along with the Weather Underground. The Weather Underground was a faction within the Students for Democratic Society. And it's really tragic when you study the history of the Students for Democratic Society, a broad pro-civil rights, anti-war student organization, which was attacked from many sides. Among them, a group of people who said that the Students for Democratic Society had to become a revolutionary organization and had to commit itself in one or another way to an armed assault upon the state. They carried out certain operations that were failures in some ways. In a brownstone in New York, they were making bombs and they blew up and a number of people were killed. But the Weather Underground, and then they took on another name, I forget it right now, fused with the Black Liberation Army in carrying out certain operations, such as bank robbing. And my contention is the Black Liberation Army, in the short period of its existence, was mainly into bank robberies. Even when Assata and her colleagues were stopped on New Jersey Turnpike, which I'm convinced the state was very aware of where they were, and this was an assault on them. And I don't think they had any intentions of entering into any armed combat with the New Jersey State Police. But it happened. One of the state police were killed, and one of the members of the Black Liberation Army was killed. Assata was not armed. They can't trace a gun to her. In fact, she was injured severely by gunshots. But at any rate, she was convicted and sentenced, I think, life and some other years tacked on in Clinton Prison, a women's facility in New York. Somehow I get something confused, and I don't know why I think for a while she was at Rawway in a kind of solitary confinement. Now, Rawway is a male prison, but when she escapes, she's at Clinton. And it's good, I think, that she was at Clinton, because then she's not in this solitary confinement situation. She's in general population, and it seems that security at Clinton was a lot less than at Rawway. But throughout the Western world and the advanced capitalist countries, groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army were popping up. In the United States, the conditions were very different than from Europe, because we'd had the Black Freedom Movement on its heel, the Black Power Movement, and the urban uprisings from 1964 to 1970. And you'd have to see it to really get what all that meant. And I've said before, these often were pitched battles, not by highly organized Black young men, but by Black young men who set up kind of, how would you say, these protected areas, often in high-rise projects. And they would have armed shootouts from the police. These uprisings every summer so regularly that they began to be known as long, hot summers. And usually it was an act of police brutality that triggered it, but the social conditions of young Black people, and especially young Black men, were such that it wouldn't take much for them to kick off, into a riot, an uprising. And we mainly refer to them as uprisings rather than riots. Some of the most spectacular were 1965 in Watts in LA. I don't know how many people were killed, but a good number. Detroit, Newark, and other places where there were pitched battles and armed confrontations with the police. Many young people, including myself, took that as a manifestation of the transition from civil rights and nonviolence to armed struggle. And the idea was that the cities would become the Black man's land. We would free the cities and use them as liberated zones from which to attack the system. We also believed that these uprisings were a reflection of a revolutionary consciousness, that Black people had reached a level of revolution, and that all that was needed were vanguards of armed guerrillas and freedom fighters. Not only did you have the Black Liberation Army, you had the Revolutionary Action Movement, other organizations would arise, such as the Republic of New Africa, the revolutionary workers' unions in Detroit, in different factories. But it was a period where so many of us believed that we were on the cusp of revolution. And therefore we had to act and would be supported by the people. As it turns out, we were not. And many of the young people who committed themselves very strongly to that tactic and strategy would end up, I think, wasting their lives. They would end up in prison, many would end up dead, many are only now getting out of prison. When I say only now, the last 5, 6 years. The idea of bank robbing was to get money to support the revolution, to buy guns, to do other things that revolutionaries needed to do. Now, this is just an aside. There were many derivative movements from this. For example, in California, a group known as the Symbionese Liberation Army, whether that was a CIA, FBI established organization, we don't know. But we do know they killed a very popular superintendent of schools in Oakland, who had been the principal of Gratz High School here in Philadelphia. Yeah, just wanton killing of anybody identified with the establishment. Here in Philly, I don't know what they called themselves, but you had very small armed groups that would carry out operations against cops, just wantonly killing this or the other cop. And there were other, kind of imitative organizations like that. And it was claimed that this was the highest point of revolutionary consciousness. Most of this organizing and activity occurs after the assassination of Martin Luther King, which I don't think is insignificant. I recall in early 1980s, meeting Huey Newton in Cuba. This is when I think I've mentioned this to you all, when he and his family were in exile. They were trying to indict him again on some old charges. And he said to me in no uncertain terms, he said, the American Communist Party is right. By the American Communist Party, not the Communist Party of the United States. And what he was saying, right about politics. That political parties carry out politics on the basis of ideas. And anything that separates a revolutionary party from the people is not revolutionary. It is sectarian. The other thing, I want to bring this up because of Angela's role in the memorial last week. Angela became one of the most popular people, United States people, not just in the country, but around the world. The only person that rivaled her was Muhammad Ali. The two of them were more popular than presidents, senators, and everybody put together. But this Black Liberation Army ideology challenged both of them. In fact, I would even argue we're envious of them. So you know how I can't be Angela Davis, so I'm going to do something more spectacular than Angela could do, and then say to Angela, unless you do what I do, you're a coward and you're not a revolutionary. Does that mean you can see how that works? And that's what they said. That's what they were saying. That Angela was a member of the Communist Party, and therefore the Communist Party is revisionist and not revolutionary, and therefore Angela is not revolutionary. Of course, with Muhammad Ali, the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, they deployed that against Muhammad Ali. So it was literally to take these huge figures down a peg or two in the interest of advancing revolution. And so they did not have much ideology, these Black Liberation Army, these other derivatives. By the way, MOVE is a derivative of that same thing, a direct offshoot of Black Liberation Army, Symbionese Liberation Army, this super revolutionary, and either you down with MOVE or you're the enemy of MOVE. And that's MOVE's philosophy. And I'm not making that up. For instance, the Weather Underground, oh yes, just one other thing. In the breakup of the Students for Democratic Society, along with the Weathermen, and that's, Weathermen, that's from a song by Bob Dylan, and they were first called Weathermen, then they were called the Weather Underground, which meant the more revolutionary you became, the more underground you went. The other faction was the LaRouche faction, which variously claimed itself to be Trotskyist and then neoliberal. They've been everything that you can imagine. But they too bore their way into the Students for Democratic Society, and they first called themselves the National Caucus of Labor Committees. In other words, while the Weather Underground was saying to be revolutionary, you had to be committed to armed struggle, what LaRouche and those were saying is that to be revolutionary, you had to take on a labor identity. At the same time, the LaRoucheites were identified as Trotskyists, and they, for a while, went on a rampage of attacking organizations like Amiri Baraka's organization in Newark, and the Communist Party in particular, us here in Philadelphia. And I've told you the famous nunchuck story. And once we figured out what nunchucks were, we had to take the nunchucks from them and spank their behinds with their nunchucks. But that's a whole other story. But it's this kind of not even spectacular, but things that would get you attention-getting activity. Now, most young people don't know this history at all. Even I suspect when they read Assata's autobiography, they don't really get it. And it's a narrative from one position. I don't think people would really know what the struggle between Elbridge and Huey was, and so on. But in this period, the younger generation is maybe, and I discussed this a little bit with Nuri the other night, your generation might be one of the most revolutionary that we would produce, maybe. And first of all, the young generation is totally separated from the ruling elite of this country. It wants, for the most part, nothing to do with elites, with the elite class that runs this country. The Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank with some credibility, came out with a poll a week ago. And this is really astounding. In fact, I learned about this from an article by Ed Luce in, of all places, the Financial Times. By the way, the Cato Institute and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal are very friendly. So this is not a liberal think tank. And they did a poll showing that 34% of the 19 or 18 to 29-year-olds have a favorable view of communism. Now, I came up in the period of the so-called radical 60s and 70s. We could never have imagined anything on this scale. Now, whether they know what communism is not the point. But they are rejecting bourgeois democracy in the capitalist system. It is, in fact, a judgment upon both in the ruling class of this country. 63% of that generation, which, by the way, I had to realize is y'all's generation. Mm-hmm. So you're swimming in the waters that is your generation. Mm-hmm. This is not, what we talk about here is not isolated from many young people, but 63% of them see socialism as positive. So that means that a diminishing part of the younger generation sees capitalism as positive. And why should they? Why should they? And I think these numbers reflect that they're totally alienated from the system, and I would argue it will take a lot to bring them back. Now, when I mentioned this to Nuri on Thursday, she made a very correct corrective for me. She said, but there's no leadership that could unite all of this. And she's absolutely right. With all of these opinions, and of course, the 60s and 70s was the Cold War, anti-communism, anti-Sovietism. Everybody that opposed anything in the system was a communist or a dupe of the Soviet Union. Well, you don't have that these days. But there is not the leadership of that period. There is no Assata, there is no Angela, there is no Muhammad Ali, there is no Henry Winston, there is no Martin Luther King Jr., and on and on and on. But nonetheless, a generation has given up on the system and are seeking paths to revolutionary change, not just reformist change. That's why, younger people will vote for Mamdani or vote for Chris Robb, and they just vote for them. They don't believe in them. They see them as the opposite to establishment politicians, but they don't believe in them because they think that they too are opportunists and they are seeking something different. Now, what will that crystallize into? We can't say. And it's going to take some time, really. But I agree with Nuri that these numbers are not a sign that this generation will go to the next stage. By the way, just on that 18 to 29, really, we're looking at everything below the baby boomers who have been just totally, they're through with the system in every way. They want very little to do with the system and representatives of the system. And so you can imagine Assata, the legend of Assata, the legend of Angela Davis, the legend of these heroic women of the 1960s. You can imagine how appealing they will be to the younger generation. And I'm always impressed with stories of younger women who will say, reading Assata's biography changed my life. And sometimes I'm a little bit dismissive, and then I realize that I shouldn't be. Maybe her life and what she represents did change their lives, and so on. But then there was this memorial last week, as I said, at Riverside Church. About 1,000 people turned out. From what I could observe, mainly baby boomers or people of Assata's generation, but there were young people. It was visually very appealing. I would even say seductive. And I've watched it on YouTube. But it was politically superficial. And just one indication of it. Until a lawyer, one of Assata's lawyers, a guy by the name of Lennox Hines, spoke, there was no mention of Cuba or Fidel Castro at all. And without Cuba and without Fidel Castro, you don't have Assata. She would either still be in prison or dead. And the United States, up to and including the Obama administration, were always trying to make a deal. We will lift or soften sanctions on Cuba if you turn Assata over to us. And they, on the basis of international law and political morality, refused to do it. Now, I'm looking at this event, and we're going through speaker after speaker, and they're talking about everything but Fidel and the Cuban Revolution. I felt that not only was it a mistake, but more than a mistake, it indicated the lack of political courage and political morality of the people that put this on. And I would say it to them with the quickness. You're political cowards. You understand what I'm saying? However, I did call Lennox, and I congratulated him. And I hadn't spoken to him for a long time. We had been in Ethiopia, Cuba, different parts of Africa together. And I said, Dig, man, I want to congratulate you on your courage. And to me, he seemed a little bit frail even as he spoke. But, you know, he's politically on point. But he tried to convince me that, well, he was trying to reflect the fact that Assata united people who don't speak to each other. I said, but Lennox, that was not a broad audience. That was a very narrow event. And, you know, 1,000 people in New York ain't no big deal, you know, given the size of the population. So, I congratulate him. He spoke extensively about the Cubans, about Fidel, about the Cubans' role in Africa, especially in Angola, in defeating the South African army in Angola, and all this type of thing. And then one or two people mentioned Cuba, but very mild. The slogan for the day was "Free the Land." Now, what that slogan means, you have to explain it to me. Free what land? I thought revolutionaries wanted to free the people. You know, free the land for what purpose? You know, but it was just free the land. Repeat after me, free the land. But that is the generation between the baby boomers and Gen Z, Gen X. They are the generation, let us say, of Tupac Shakur, of what's his name? Bey, Islam. He took on a Muslim name. Yes. What was his original name?
Most Def.
Most Def, maybe KRS-One, that generation of, when I put quotes, radicals, some of whom had gone to Cuba, you know, in the late 90s, I think, on a joint project of fusing hip hop and political radicalism. But it was so interesting, I don't know that they talk about it very much, but the Cubans insisted that gangster rap would not be performed in Cuba. And that they asked the US rappers that they wanted to see whatever speeches they were going to make beforehand. This is hardly mentioned. By the way, going forward a few years hence from that, there was a, quote, black youth uprising in Cuba, which was linked to hip hop. And I think we have to keep our eyes on this, by the way. It became that kind of affair. Angela's speech was not a revolutionary speech, but that because Angela ceased to be a revolutionary maybe about 30 years ago. And I say that not as condemnation for Angela, but as a recognition of the fact. Even out of her own mouth, she became a social democrat, more aligned to the Democratic Party and the liberal wing of the ruling elites. At the essence or core of her presentation was Assata as more or less a feminist, and how Assata stood up for women and was a symbol for women, including gay women and trans women. And that's the way she kind of put it, which is more aligned with the liberal feminist than with either Cuba or the growing struggles for freedom and national liberation going on today. But of course, Angela's always graceful. She was always that way, even young. She's very graceful, very respectful, but that's her politics. And she spoke alongside Mark Monthill. The only time that two people spoke like that, and I watched most of it, and I am very, and have not been comfortable with Mark's feminism and LGBTQ politics since he came back to Philadelphia. I won't go into details right now, but if you ask me, I'll tell you. He's always attempting to position himself politically to be embraced by elements of the ruling class, which puts him at odds with most of the grassroots people in Philly. Now, I say all of that, I took a long time. My meeting with Assata. I knew of her, I don't think she knew anything about me. She may have, because of the split in the world communist movement and maybe some things I've written, and they were maybe studied in Cuba. But I don't think she necessarily did. The occasion was the 30th anniversary of Fidel and Malcolm X's meeting at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem. Now, the background is that the ruling class hated Fidel and the Cuban revolutionaries so much that when they came to New York to speak at the UN General Assembly, no hotel in Manhattan would rent rooms to the delegation. And that is when Malcolm X reached out to Fidel and the others. I think Che was on that delegation as well. And Malcolm, who knew the owners of the Teresa Hotel on 125th Street, organized for the Cuban delegation to stay in Harlem. And that was a great moment for Black folk, for Cubans, and Fidel never forgot that. He was always grateful. Whenever he came to speak at the UN, he would also speak in Harlem. Mm-hmm. And he was very closely attuned to Black people and the Black struggle. Mm-hmm. So this was the 30th anniversary of that in 1990. So the seminar, I think it was a 2-day seminar, was organized by a group of Black radicals more aligned to the Black Liberation Army and others like RAM and so on. And they excluded the Communist Party.
This was in Cuba.
This was in Cuba. Yeah, in Cuba. And so the comrades in Cuba who were also a part of organizing this, you know, Cuba is the security down there is deep. You're not just coming up in there, like I told you about the hip hoppers. You're not just gonna come up there and do your thing. Mm-hmm. It has to be filtered and so on. So, but the Cubans came to the organizers, one of whom I knew them all very, very well, Abdullah Kalimat. They have these very beautiful Muslim names, although they're not Muslims. I know Abdul like I know you all. Gerald McWhorter, very, very intelligent cat. He, one of the organizers, and some others, I forget their names now. And they said to them, they said, look, you don't have anybody from the Communist Party here. And if you're going to have this in Cuba, we insist that the Communist Party have a representative here. Mm. And that was the principle of international solidarity in the World Communist Movement. Mm. You know, and it's a great principle, believe me. So I was the head of the Black Liberation Commission at that time. And Noor, you know, reading all those documents, the 1989 conference, and we still got some things we still got to go back up there and get. You know, so all of this is going on, and Cuba stands more closely to where we stood than they did to Gorbachev, or even the French and Italian communist parties, and certainly the elements that would ultimately split from the Communist Party here to form a social democratic organization. Among them, and in the forefront of them, was Angela Davis, but others, you know what I'm saying? So the Cubans, in the name of the solidarity of communist parties at this time where Gorbachev was trying to break the world movement up and separate everybody, they said, no, you just can't, you have to have a representative of the Communist Party. So I ended up going there. Mm-hmm. And I was not in necessarily hostile territory. I mean, you know, Stokely Carmichael, and I told you all about how he gave me the name down there. I won't repeat it. And Max Stanford, Abdul. I think there were about 30 of us, and the seminar took place around a round table, which also allowed for the translation of the proceedings into Spanish. And so I'm sitting there, and I look across, and I see a familiar woman. It turns out it was Assata. And, you know, my first impression was that she was a very a shy person. And she spoke, I don't quite remember what her speech was on. I think those documents are somewhere, the audio and the written form of them, where I do not know. And I know if a Kalimat got them, he's going to hold them, you know, until the day he dies, and then I guess try to sell them off or something. But no, maybe not so. But you can't get access to them. And I remember speaking. I don't recall actually what I said. I have to admit that. But I was speaking more or less for the Communist Party, and I think I was speaking more or less in line with Henry Winston and the Black struggle, centrality of Black liberation, the international obligation of the struggle for Black liberation. And I think I may have mentioned how we could not fall prey to ideas that would exclude Black people from the broader movements of change, you know. So I think on, I forget all, but I think it was the second day of the symposium. I'm in my room, and I hear somebody knock on the door, open. It's Assata. I didn't know her. I mean, I knew her. I didn't think she knew me. She came in, again, very polite, very shy. You know, we talked a bit about her life in Cuba. And I'm trying to remember everything now. But we talked about her life in Cuba, how grateful she was to the Cuban nation. But then she said, the Cubans insisted that I go to the higher party school. The higher party school is the kind of the university for the party leadership and younger people in the party that are rising up the ranks to leadership, either governmental or party leadership, or maybe in unions or whatever. And for leadership, you had to have political education. You know, it's not going to be because you have a beautiful personality and are good at shaking hands and all of the women swoon over you when you walk in a room. That's not the way they hold elections down there. You know, so, well, you know, it's not a bourgeois affair. It's really serious. And they insisted that she go to the party school, not just classes, but the higher party school. And as I recall, she said to me, they insisted that I go. The other factor that we have to take into account, and I don't know that we discussed this, she and I, but the role of Cuba in the African independence movements, especially in Southern Africa. Now, take Assata before Cuba and before she's arrested. I don't think she had much political education at all. It was all from the gut, all from the heart, not from theory. And so we knew the system was oppressive. We knew it had to be overthrown, but there was no connection to history. I don't think she had ever read, I'm pretty certain that none of them had read Du Bois, and they saw King as a mild reformist, you know, and they, of course, were the revolutionary vanguard. So she didn't know theory. She didn't know history, you know, but here is and so she's in this new information ecosystem. That is Cuba. That is the world. You know, it's a whole different reality. The Cuban Academy of Science was built upon, and most of the leading people in it were educated in the Soviet Union. It was built upon the Soviet Academy of Science. You know what I'm saying? Very similar. The party's relationship to social science, all of this was pretty much like the Soviet Union. So she is now in a different ideological, intellectual ecosystem. She's learning and growing. She's becoming a different person. She's studying political economy, modern world history, World War II, and the Soviet victory. She's learning about the Vietnam War, and I'm certain seeing and meeting delegations from these communist parties in Vietnam, the Soviet Union, coming through. She was also probably acutely aware of Gorbachev and his selling out of the Cuban Revolution and leaving them to face what Fidel called double sanctions, sanctions from the Soviet Union and from the United States. It was a horrible period, a special period, as they called it. I don't know how Fidel lived through it, because he had to constantly encourage the Cuban people, constantly be on post. So she's a part of all of this. Her friends who casually are coming through and who harbor deep anti-Soviet political views, and I'm not saying that based on something I heard, I know they did because I knew them. And all kinds of weird notions such as Stokely Carmichael, that the revolution in the United States would issue from the student uprising in West Africa. Will you explain how that's going to happen? It's the craziest kind of stuff you could ever imagine. And so I would say certainly by 1990, Assata was on a much higher ideological and political level than any of the people visiting her. I won't use names right now, but I know many of them so well, and I know where they are right now, where they were back then, having come up with them, and where they are right now, that most of what she stood for, they rejected. Okay, let me just end here. She came to visit me, not knowing me, because I was a member of the Communist Party, a representative of the Communist Party, and she wanted to share ideas. She told me a bit about her daughter, who had lived in Cuba with her for a while, but now had come back to the United States. In some ways, as I think back upon it, I got a sense of her loneliness. And she would have to be, she would want to be a part of this movement here. But she was grateful to the Cuban Revolution. Just the last thing. The Cubans were not, quote, super revolutionaries. They were not like people that we see marching around the city of Philadelphia. In fact, there is a conference of the Revolutionary Communists of America here in Philadelphia this weekend. I happened to see something on Facebook where all of these young white people were waving these red flags with the hammer and sickle. I'd really like to just see them, just to observe the spectacle. And that's what it is. And I'm not saying it's bad. I know where they're coming from. They're trying to invent something, to create something without a deep enough understanding of the history of their own country, and certainly know nothing about the Black freedom movement. You know, and I know what these are Trotskyites, self-acknowledged, they call themselves Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyists. But they're all over the place, the Revolutionary Communist Party. Everywhere you look, you have such organizations. And they're strongly made up of young white males, which indicates a crisis of males, young males. But you rarely see a Black person in their ranks, rarely. So here you have a generation that rejects the system, but does not know how to go forward. At the core of their rejection of the system is their rejection of white supremacy. I do not trivialize this. You know, you get a lot of Black people who anything that any white people do against racism or rejection of, oh, that ain't genuine, they don't know what it is to be Black. Well, no, they don't know what it is to be Black, but they know what whiteness has done to them and this country, you know, and take it for what it's worth. And so this is positive. Even I was saying Alice, you know Hassan Piker? You remember Haas? Y'all remember Haas?
Yes.
Back, he became very popular in the free school one period. Isn't that true? No. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I thought so. Maybe I misread the situation. But, you know, he's like a new version of Haas. You know how these cats, they just can't be political. They have to take photos showing their muscles. See, I'm cut, I got a six-pack. What that got to do with politics, money? You could have a 3-pack and still be good. Oh, yeah, maybe a 1-pack. But, so I'll end on this. How do you go forward without an understanding of the Birmingham movement and Martin Luther King Jr.? This is that part of the future that is obscured. They could and probably will, without proper direction, repeat the mistakes of the Black Liberation Army and the Weather Underground and other so-called extreme guerrilla armed movements. And I would just recommend, if you have the chance, to relook at that free school where we talked about the Birmingham movement, Kathy and Alice and Emily, and then Michelle's presentation, which I was looking at yesterday, yeah. These discussions are a valuable resource for young generations seeking a way forward. You know, one side of the equation has been fulfilled, that is the rejection of the old. But the side about the creation of the new, they don't know. And most young people, without guidance, will always associate revolution with tearing down. The hard part is the creative rebuilding. And so I'll stop there.
I can say something. Well, I wanted to say I appreciate your tribute and also your scientific assessment of Assata Shakur, and then how you situate her kind of among the titans of the Black liberation movement.
Yes.
Huey Newton, and also what you were saying reminded me of the tribute you had made to Glenn Ford when he passed away maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And then the memorial was also at Riverside Church in Harlem. So it actually made me think of like a formative year for my thinking, which was 2018, because that was the year that I had taken a gap year in college. And it's because I was seeking a moral or a political education. And as a part of that year, I just read a lot. And some of the thinkers that I encountered for the first time were Malcolm X and then Assata Shakur. And I just agree with your assessment that it's very natural for young people that want to find a way for political change, kind of end up landing in this ideological period, which immediately succeeds the nonviolent movement and the civil rights movement. And what I remember about Assata Shakur from her biography, her autobiography, is that really famous line, like, "We have nothing to lose but our chains."
Yeah.
And that was a very popular line at the time, or slogan.
Which is from the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Maybe I do remember that a little bit. But I think that the people that I was situated among at that time, which is some leftists in Philadelphia, we were attracted to that dogged commitment to freedom, or that dogged commitment to humanity. But I agree that buried or more difficult to locate was a deeper political strategy for how all of it could be achieved. And hearing you speak again, some of the distinguishing line that I see between that 60s movement and that 70s, 80s movement is really the question of violence and nonviolence.
Yes, that's right.
And how a political movement will be organized on the basis of these very opposite principles.
Can I just say one thing just to
Sure,
add?
sure.
And the question of the role of the people. See, if it is the armed detachment, then the people are just spectators.
Yeah, I think we admire her commitment, but I think it leads you astray to mimic that life, like you're describing with maybe the Weather Underground or these violent guerrilla groups. But a lot of how I've come to see the Black freedom movement through our study is that we have examples of nonviolent guerrilla armies, nonviolent guerrilla warfare. These campaigns that emerge, in different periods of time in different locations. So yeah, I just appreciated your remarks.
Could you talk more about Deruba? And
NYE.
Because you had said earlier something about the Black Liberation Army people are and will continue to kind of claim Assata for their own kind of ongoing political agenda. I was curious about if you could talk more about him, because someone also brought it up in the comments.
Yes. I don't know a lot about that world. By the time they become prominent, I'm in a whole different political world. So I didn't know them, a lot of their names, but the ones who remain in prison or recently got out of prison have been memorialized and their names kept alive by the Jericho movement, which is a movement to free all political prisoners, and their slogan is "Free 'em all, free 'em all," But I don't know them. Like Deruba, I know he was in prison for a number of years, I think maybe 20 years. But outside of that, I don't know much about him. He arose in the context of this memorial because the people that organized it said they had invited him and couldn't get in touch with him. And he has a different story, which kind of reads like, I felt it was reformist and they didn't want to talk about Assata as a soldier in the Black Liberation Army, and that according to him, and I don't think this is accurate, she remained a Black Liberation Army soldier to the day she died, which means that she remained loyal to that ideology. My reading now.
Mhm.
And you know, one thing, it was one meeting,
Mhm.
maybe 2 hours. You know what I'm saying? But I think the fact that she sought me out, and I'm no big name in anything,
Mhm.
but it was because of what I was a part of.
Mhm.
And I read this meeting is that she was a part of that also. And that maybe it was difficult for her to have such a conversation or to explain her development and transition to her friends,
Mhm.
even up to this period, the last period of her life. And, you know, Daruba, very well-known name, you know, because of the Black Liberation Army and, you know, and some of the spectacular things they did, like robbing banks or robbing,
Mhm.
you know, these trucks that carry money.
Mhm.
And then the escape of Assata Shakur. These were spectacular things, but that don't make you right politically. And so I don't think I've ever met him, and pretty much not interested in him. But to keep himself alive, to keep himself, he has to say that I remain one of the few loyalists of the Black Liberation Army. And I think that's how he rolls these days. I don't know if that answered the question adequately.
What were people's like ordinary people's perception of the Black Liberation Army at the time?
What are people? What I remember and perceive of that period, people have a way of differentiating between recklessness. Now, because they were young people, a lot of people wanted to protect them, as they should, you know. When I say protect them, hoping nothing bad happens. I don't remember big movements of, you know, to free them from prison in terms of movements that would have a political prisons like Free Huey, Free Angela, movements like that. I think also by this time that what remained of the Black Panthers didn't want much to do with them because it was connected to Eldridge Cleaver. And they, by this time, and it really is the importance of Huey Newton, that his idea that the gun, that by identifying the Panther Party with the gun, alienated the party from the people. Because people actually, as I think about it, what he was saying to me was that this high emphasis upon violence turned people off, you know, and you can't have a discourse about a political future with an AK-47. You know what I'm saying? And that kind of militarism. And he was right about that. You take the Black Liberation Army, their solutions were only military solution, armed struggle solutions. And could they educate the masses? No, because they were always carrying out these bank robberies and other things and on the run and underground. So they've lost touch with the masses of people. And that's what Huey said to me. He said, he talked, you know, when you see him, he doesn't sound the way he looks. You know, at least I didn't think. Very high pitch, you know, and he talked kind of fat, the American Communist Party, you know, like that. And he said, no, we had to, he said, you all were right. Which I took to mean that Winston was right. That a political party had to have a political program. It had to be political. It could not be a militarist thing. Just like these young brothers and sisters walking around here in Philadelphia with AKs. You know, what is that? I mean, it's to the point it ain't even cute no more. It used to be back, you go back to the 70s, you see somebody with an AK, you say, God damn, brother, you got an AK, you know, because the AK was associated with huh?
It was associated with revolution.
Yeah, and associated with the guerrillas in Southern Africa. And, you know, you had an AK. First of all, where you get it from? But anyway, but that ain't all that no more. You know what I'm saying? And doing provocative acts to get you Facebook or social media clicks to get, you know, the algorithm favors people that behave like that. And you can even get an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer. But, and then have a stand where you're giving out food to the people and all of that. But wait a minute, money? Give me a job. Can you help me get a job? You talking about here's some free bananas and shit. Let me, you got an application so I can get a job. But it's so separated from the people that it's hard to even explain. And the only people it appeals to are young people, and especially young men who are alienated from the system and from their communities often.
Yeah, I was, because I know you've talked about it before, but like what kind of the environment that you were in, the way that people talked, that sense of, oh yeah, the city is a black man's land, we can free the cities. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm just curious, but like what did people really think was going to happen? Like I think I'm still trying to make sense of like what even people thought would happen, or like what the goals were, or like, was it for like separation between like black and white people? Was it to like overthrow the government? Like, I get a little confused about like what people.
Well, if you were confused, I was confused. You know, because you see, with young people like this, you know, I don't care whether they're Trotskyites or revolutionary nationalists. One thing about them, young people, and especially young men, they see revolution as destructive. They don't see a creative option. So, and therefore they don't see a people's option. And just to give myself as an example, you know, if there were to be a discourse, let us say, between me and the ruling class, that would be the binary, not me and the people. You know, it is a revolutionary strategy where you don't speak to the people that much. You act on behalf of the people. See, that's what makes kings so important. I mean, speaking to the people, educating the people, moving the people. And that's what the Birmingham movement also shows. But I think if you look at most young people that, you know, I mean, I can't say most, I don't know what percentage, but who in one way want to change the system, it is almost a one-way tunnel vision of destruction, and there is no, they'll say, well, we want socialism. You know, but even what is that? But the main thing is destroying the system and not that much about creating something new.
In some ways, I think you're helping clarify even someone like Chris Smalls. Because actually, this past Tuesday, Doc and I, as well as John, who's not here, we went to go see Chris Smalls speak. And he's the former president of the Amazon Labor Union. So it's the only facility of all the factories of Amazon across the country that was successfully unionized. And it was a very difficult feat. Like, it's notorious, it's extremely difficult to unionize warehouses because the conditions are so poor that the turnover of the workers doing that type of work is very high. And it's deliberate. People are so overworked, so underpaid that like it creates a sort of like low morale that people don't even reach a place to be able to successfully fight such a large company to unionize. And so to this day, he is the only, and it's just very clear when you look at it, he really was that leader who was, maybe because he was popular, some of it's because he had natural instincts. But he's from New Jersey, and New Jersey is one of those states with like a lot of warehouses for some reason, more than like other places. I don't know why, but he was working at the New York, I think the Staten Island warehouses, and they successfully unionized in 2021 or 2022, I forget. But when we saw him speak, and we went to go really see him because he's one of those new legends. Like, I have not seen anyone else in our generation who is being put forward as a legend, not that dissimilar from Assata or Angela in the 60s and 70s. And so we wanted to really see him. He just released a book called The Revolution Will Not Wait, I think, something like that. And it's basically the story of how they unionized this warehouse, and it has not been replicated, even though a dozen other facilities have tried to unionize. And the thing that really struck me when we were trying to assess him is, it's not like he spoke in a really loud, brash way, but it's a very narcissistic, I-centered way. And he's no longer the president of the Amazon Labor Union because he was fired by Amazon, and then he got replaced by these like white leftists who purposely took up jobs in that warehouse to become the leaders of this like notorious union now. But he's still a very prominent voice in like the labor movement, in what's seen as like the left progressive, the anti-war movement. Like, he's very well known nowadays for going on these flotillas to Gaza to show the brutality of the Israeli government, this white supremacist government and state. But he was also well known for interrupting the Met Gala to make a point that the Met Gala is like a distraction. It's like a distraction of normal people by billionaires.
Paid for by Bezos.
Yes, and it's paid for by Bezos. But the thing that we were discussing afterwards that I'm connecting to Assata is, Chris Smalls, he's a child of the 70s. And he's like actually
the 80s, I would say.
But 80s. No, you're right, because he's 38, so it must be the 80s. He's a child of the 80s. Yeah. He's like that millennial, I guess he's a millennial, but in some ways I connect him to this generation of young people who grew up in those brutal decades of the 70s, 80s, 90s. And he kind of still is shaped by this imaginary of Assata, for example, the belief of an individual act to get attention, like the belief that you need to get attention on behalf of the people who are suffering, rather than, for example, something that I think we see ourselves concerned about. How do you unite the people through struggle, through principle, for a positive vision? And because something that struck me a lot was he sounded honestly defeated and sad. He didn't talk anything about how will we unite the people who are in many different sections of society rejecting what they understand to be the status quo or the system. And I was so surprised that he'd never reached that place of even beginning to talk about, for someone who successfully organized 700, 1,000 workers into a union. I was surprised that he had not seemed to he didn't really have much advice to give to all these young people asking questions about what's next, what do we do? And that showed me something, because in some ways it's because there is still a little bit of that zeitgeist, that little bit of that legend we have inherited what subconsciously the legends of Angela, the legends of Assata, of like, there's still a lot of young people believing in the individual act.
But I have to say that, you know, because I knew, the most that I knew about Chris Moss was from Emily.
Yeah.
And a couple of years ago, we had talked about him a lot in the opposition to him. And then going there and seeing this, and you're right, he did seem to be very low-key, almost depressed, defeated, but he looked like an early version of Lil Wayne. And, you know, with all of this gold, you know, and then a grill, you know. So, you know, person from my generation, where even if you ain't making the big sacrifice, you don't want to look like you know, a materialist and all of that. You don't want that kind of image. And if you take like Assata, you take like Angela, they would never present themselves that way. Of course, Angela wouldn't, and Assata wouldn't, because they wanted to be known as revolutionaries, not as hip hop artists. And I think there's a difference. So it was, and I wasn't hostile to it, but I was put off by it. And when he only talked about I and what I did and and it just, you know, whenever I'm in a situation like that, it feels like somebody is beating me over the head with a stick, because it's just exhausting. Weren't there other people involved? And of course, you know, you take even, you know, like Assata, Angela, they would always talk about the movement, the revolutionaries, the people, and, you know, it would be that kind of framing of things. And he seems to be more influenced by hip hop culture than by revolutionary ideas. And he believes that kind of cultural presentation shows his generation that you're really down with them, because you're taking on cultural forms that they take on. But then, you know, you look like Lil Wayne and people done moved on to Kendrick Lamar. You know, so it's, you know, you see what I'm saying? It's something of a disconnect. Like he was living 15 years earlier. I mean, it had on these short pants. I mean, you know, it just, you know, he did not look like a serious man. And I know Gabe wanted me to hang out with them afterwards. And I told Emily I wanted to, but it'd be too much work. I was just, you know, the work that would have to go into just explaining things. It would take a lot of time, a lot out of you. I want to do it. I really wish I could. But have you noticed, what's his name? Caleb Maupin on Facebook. He's been, we stand with Chris Small and another person.
Kishama Swan.
Huh?
Kishama Swan from Washington State. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I didn't see that one. But they said, what they were saying is that because the Facebook thing is about this review of his book.
Yeah, the Jacobin article.
Yeah, the Jacobin article. And they said it was racist, and that Chris Small is attacking, because Chris Small is attacking the racism of Bernie Sanders and AOC, that's why these Jacobin, people who run Jacobin, are supporting this review, because the review attacks Chris Small because Chris Smalls is attacking the Social Democrats. That might be partially true, but that essay got a lot right from what I saw. He abandoned the union. When he was supposed to be on post, he was running around the country as a celebrity. He missed the point. but like it was the first time it was done. He doesn't know the union. So he did something that had never been done and then couldn't maintain it. But he's a good guy, I think, with certain personal problems. You know what I'm saying? Egotism, this idea that celebrity, you build movements with celebrity. Well, Angela is a celebrity, but she didn't, I mean, she won that the hard way by sacrifice and by being on post, man. Well, that's it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. One thing that's hitting me really hard when you are talking about the individual being at the center of a movement is that what we're taught, anybody that is going to be a servant to the people has to have humility. And they have to have the characteristic of humility, which doesn't mean you think less of yourself or you think yourself as lowly, but you think about yourself less. You think about the needs of the people before you, which is a great sacrifice. But that comes with time. That comes with purification of your heart and your mind. So people fall. So many rise as idols, but they fall quickly because of that one default in character, lack of humility, and even passing down what they have learned and know to work and cause change. You have to teach someone else. You have to have somebody that is going to carry it on into perpetuity forever. And so always having the humility and love to pass down with everything that you know to someone else so that they can actually stand on your shoulders and bring it to the next level takes, once again, great humility. So it's just interesting seeing how now in 2026 we're looking for those leaders in our community, but they fall so quickly because of that character flaw.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I also wanted to appreciate the way that you had situated it around the state of like this current younger generation and like the polling data and all that stuff. And I think, you know, in the free school, it's obvious that we would say things that, you know, for instance, that Martin Luther King should not have been assassinated. What would the movement have looked like, for example, if King had not been assassinated? But in many ways, no one can know exactly what would have happened. And in many ways, we are still, you're left with the history that actually happened. And part of that is you need to make sense of basically the way that the political winds changed after the assassination of King with the rise of Black Power, and then these even more kind of, you could say, like extreme sectarian groups like the Black Liberation Army. And like I feel like you can't operate in America today without having some way of making sense of what actually happened with that movement of history. And like Emily was saying, like, even though I'm the child of immigrants, I still feel like in that way, we've inherited both the Black freedom movement as we talked about it, but we've also inherited a lot of the contradictions of what came afterwards. And the task of actually making sense of it and trying to find a way through that history. And I think, also, I think in response to what Sister you were saying too, part of the challenge I feel like for our generation is that it is important to pass down history, especially for those who live through it. But it's like when you have figures, like without knowing even the specifics about all of them, but it's like when you have those kinds of people who are really in it, become in it, like maybe they come into it with different intentions, but it becomes about them. It's very logical actually that many of those people, especially if they're still around, or if they come out of prison, all that stuff, they would want to keep making it about them. And that's kind of they're the ones a lot of times who are the most visible face of that period of radical struggle, revolutionary struggle of the 60s and 70s. And they're the ones oftentimes who are the most out there and the most vocal in terms of presenting their version of what that period meant to a younger generation that didn't live through it. And I think, yeah, it's like, I think that's part of I found it really valuable, I think, the way that you talked through it. But yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think that that model is obsolete because it doesn't work versus it being a group of people versus it being an individual at the core of a movement? Like, it's proven that that doesn't work.
Like which model?
So even the idea of white supremacy, no one person is at the head of it. Yet it's been able to be perpetuated throughout time for thousands of years. So if we not take that model, but reject the model that one person has to be at the center of a movement in the face of it, and they carry the whole burden of carrying out a revolution or changing the world, whereas we really unite. Like that being the core idea, instead of putting it all on one person, like that is the real way or method that we should use.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. I feel like, because I think there's one aspect of it which is about individuals, but I think that mentality, I think, can also include like a group. It can be about like, oh, our group we are the real revolutionaries, everyone else is not. And I feel like that was kind of what Doc was talking about. That mentality, the real question is, it increasingly separates you from like ordinary people, and it just becomes about your group, whether it's about the individual or the group itself. And I feel like that's part of what like we're trying to make sense of.
Right.
But I think, yeah, so I agree. I think it's both about the individuals, but also like I think it can be about like a group of people, and like it just seems like part of what happened with that period after King's assassination was like in the moment the kinds of lessons that people were taking from it, including people like Stokely, Kwame Ture, who had been part of SNCC, who had been involved very deeply in the freedom movement, was like, yeah, this thing of we have to always position ourselves as the most revolutionary, but then like that becomes its own end, and it becomes less about like what you were saying, actually the point of it being both to serve the people, but to also unite broader parts of the people, in order to even have any kind of faith or optimism about the future. Like for me, like I only have any kind of optimism about the future, not even so much like about us as like the Saturday free school, but because I have some sense of like, oh, like there is like the consciousness of the people at large is changing and can be changed.
I think what you're saying is so interesting because I've been reflecting on, I think, basically the same question, which is what is actually going to be the model or like the way of revolutionary change now in the 21st century. And looking at the 60s in particular, and then also the 20th century, you see so many examples of incredible leaders, like King, and then around the world, like all of these world leaders, like Fidel, like Sukarno. And I feel like when you study that history, you know that humanity or that man is capable of reaching a place of character and principle and humility, and that there are leaders who don't let their ego get in the way and truly like are close to the people and are serving the people every day. And I feel like in some ways, Doc, like what you were saying about the fact that so many people today are disappointed with the system, have turned their back against it, and yet in some ways, like we are not fully in movement. And I feel like the question basically has to be like, is there not leadership for this time? And I feel like then my question is like, one, why is there not leadership? Because I can't accept that like having achieved this level that it's just natural or that there's something deficient about like this generation or this time. Like, I don't subscribe to that. And I feel like we can also see like all of the attacks that the ruling class have made with like criminalization, attacking all of the people who would be leaders organically. And I think also baiting them, tempting them with like personal gain
or this thing of celebrity. And I feel like all of that is true. And yet part of my question, yeah, is that is there potentially like a new idea of democracy or a new idea of what like a movement would even look like, where it would genuinely be like a mass movement? Because I think even the 20th century was in some ways pioneering of like a new kind of politics.
Yes.
Like when we think about, I guess, like Gandhi and the Indian freedom struggle, like, or the mobilization of like an entire society to achieve like a new nation. And all of those, I feel like we remember the leaders, but part of what I think we're also trying to do is to understand the relationship of the leaders to the people, and to study also like all of the ordinary people who ascended to a new level, but whose names we don't know. And I feel like all of it basically does make me ask, like, today, is it not that, like, do we not need to wait for a new leader or like an anointed leader to arise, but is there a level of consciousness or a level of character that actually all people or more of the people can like ascend to, and that through that would be like the premise for a new movement. But I feel like that even like on a ideas level or like on a theoretical level, I feel like we're still trying to work out. And in some ways, I feel like for us, like I feel like for me, part of why I gravitate so much, or why I think Martin Luther King Jr. is so important, is because he had that relationship with the people. And I feel like that's also, Doc, like why we've been talking about like Birmingham more too. And in some ways, like Jeremiah was saying, because he was assassinated, we will never know where King and the movement that he led might have gone. But in some ways, I think the question is, what of King can still live in the people and in all of us, and what does it basically leave us with, like the responsibility or the work that we need to do to basically carry that forward, even if he as like a man is no longer living. But yeah, I feel like it's a big question for the 21st century, because we know that people are capable of so much, and yet there's so much like chaos and division and confusion. And I feel like when like we talk to people, like everybody knows that like the way that things are like just can't stand, or that nobody wants it to. But then I think the question is, what would actually unite the people to give us a sense of our own strength and a sense of our own capacity?
Just, I like this idea because, we've been thinking about models of leadership. And, one of the things in this 250th anniversary of the U.S. Revolution, one of the books we're reading is a book by a man named Taylor, at least volume 1 of a trilogy by Taylor Branch, America in the King Years. And, we're going through it, and we get to the Birmingham movement. And it's Emily, Kathy, Alice, and myself. And the Birmingham movement has so impacted us. And, King says, in fact, that this 1963 movement was the real beginning of the civil rights movement, because masses of people were ready to go to jail. And that's a mass movement. And, I don't know, Emily, you might want to say something about it, but we've been kicking around this concept. Can we look at Philadelphia as a 21st century Birmingham? And is the model of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference a model, not the only model, a model of leadership, of self-sacrificing men and women who, when they went into Birmingham, they only had 13 people. And the power of ideas, and of course, then you have Martin Luther King, who is such a singular figure. But that, we have been, just like Nuri was talking about, we have been trying to think about models of leadership. And I don't know whether you're aware, we did a very extensive interview with student minister Ishmael Muhammad. Did you see it?
No, no.
Oh, we're gonna get it to you.
Please.
Yeah, it was, the man is no joke.
No, it's
He is no joke, you know, and it was, well, who was it? Oh, it was, well, Michelle and who were the, Meghna and Jahan and myself. And it was 2 days, 3 hours, a little over 3 hours each time. And then Jeremiah and Blaze, and then they've done an interview. Albert. Wasn't Blaze in there too? Okay, I'm sorry. Oh, and Albert, I'm sorry, Al. But they interviewed Apostle Crawford of the United House of Prayer for All People. Yeah, a very brilliant man. And then we did a interview, I know this is Michelle, and I forget everybody, and Shantu, yeah, with Brother Gregory Muhammad about the prison ministry, because we're interested in models of leaders, and we consider every one of these people a leader, you know? And so that, yeah, this is, but I guess I think this is what Nuri was saying to me. How do we bring these narratives to the younger generation who have rejected everything? And they would probably see Minister Ishmael, well, he's just a part of a strong, powerful organization. And he's, you know, because so much of what is called radical is about the tearing down. And anything that is not torn down already is a part of the system, some people would think.
I promise to be quiet after this.
No, keep going.
My ears running. Because even a government body, the word body, so we learn about the 10 systems of the human body, the brain being the 10th that coordinates all the other organs. And so they each have a specific function. They don't compete with each other. So organizing something that is found in nature and that we operate on every day with our own human body. So each of those groups that you spoke about or an interview with have a special gift and function. And so if we operate on that aspect, instead of there being a competition and ego and all of that involved, working in the area that each group is good at. And there's a perfect example, the National Agenda, the Red Book. Have you ever seen it?
The Nation of Islam?
The Nation of Islam. And so he interviewed so many Black organizations, even the Hispanic Caucus, economic groups, the NAACP, so many different organizations that specialize in different tasks within the community and what their role would be, because there's so much to be done in our society. There's no reason to fight over problems to be solved. So I think, you know, approaching it from an organized position and a model that already exists even in nature is a possibility. But that's what to bring it up based on what you were saying.
Yeah, sometimes when we were talking about models of leadership, in some ways, I'm not sure, even though you were asking me to speak more in Birmingham, in some ways this past week, because of where I've been taken for work and the people I've been able to meet because of certain events I went to, I started coming back to more of a focus on the word teacher, more than leader. And
That's interesting.
And it's not that, I do think that we in Free School have met leaders, and that there will be a need for leadership, especially political and ideological leadership to explain the crisis. But in some ways, I've been thinking a lot about how we used to talk about Free School as a teacher of teachers, or seeing ourselves the importance of teachings that there is such thing as teachings and the need for teachers, especially in a time like this where there's deliberate confusion. And in some ways, the most powerful weapon against people, but especially children and youth starting at a young age, is confusion about yourself and then confusion about the world. And like an example would be the number, and like maybe Michelle and Albert will talk about this, but this is the greatest difference sometimes that I had experienced coming from Asia, whether it's India or China, was that you realize coming back that there's almost like a helmet on your head if you don't fight it, that conditions you to constantly believe that ordinary people are the problem rather than, let's say, the government or the state that's supposed to be those that basically, for example, poverty in a city like Philadelphia, you're conditioned to believe it's on that man that he's poor versus that why is it that we are so satisfied with a society that allows poverty? So that's a difference, because in China or India, no matter how much poverty exists, there's not that assumption of the people are to blame for poverty. Instead, the existence of poverty is an indictment of that society, that system, that But the reason I've been thinking a lot about teachings is because I was really moved by, and the reason why I'm focusing so much on like what we call the counter-revolution of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, that period that you also raised after King was assassinated. And suddenly there was a deliberate attack by the state, by the government on this great people who were waging a struggle for freedom.
Yeah.
And I had there was this man who I paid a lot of attention, because I work for a labor union, and I had to go to Harrisburg for a 2-day conference with a lot of the nursing home members from across the state. And there was one man in particular I paid a lot of attention to, because I actually always assumed he was white, but then he always kind of talked Black. And so I was like, oh, maybe he's just like from the hood or something. But this time I had heard him talk about, he was just one of those super intelligent people who was breaking down the healthcare system. And he was talking about who is financing which part and who is really in control here. Let's not even talk about the surface level of how much we are all suffering, but let's get to the root problem of who is really behind the veil, behind the system, like behind the green curtains in the Wizard of Oz. And just the way he was thinking, I like asked him at breakfast, I was just like, yeah, you honestly, I feel like you could be one of those investigative journalists. Like, you're just super, super smart. Like, you have those gifts. And I was like, oh, how did you get them? And he was like, he just smiled at me openly. He was like, oh, I was in prison. And I was like, and what do you mean by that? And he was like, oh, I was incarcerated for 28 years. And he's 48. And he talked about how he was like, it's because I spent all my time under 23-hour lockdown every day. And I read 3 books a week. And he was like, all I did was I read nonfiction. He was like, I read lots of things, romance, science fiction, but he was like, I love nonfiction. And we immediately just started talking about James Baldwin. He threw it back at me. He was like, have you actually listened to the interview between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin? I was like, duh, of course I have. And we were just, we were really like, we just had such a good talking. And before you even told me the topic of this week's free school was on Assata, he had mentioned to me, he was like, have you read Assata Shakur? Have you read Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver? Have you read George Jackson? But he was listing, and he said, he was like, my favorite book of all time is actually The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. He was telling me, he was like, the reason why I like nonfiction, and he wanted to talk to me about the books that I was interested in, is because he was basically saying, I'm interested in an explanation for why I am in prison, why I was in federal prison for 28 years, or for why the things are the way they are. And we even talked about the financing of hip hop. Like, he said Jews, and I was looking around to see who was paying attention to us say that. But he was like very open, and to me just showed me that, versus, let's say, Chris Smalls, who had just seen this big labor leader at the top. Here you have, at the grassroots level, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of men exactly like him. And I did end up asking, I was like, I hope you're not offended, but like, are you Black? And he was like, yeah, like, because he has an Italian last name. He was like, yeah, my father's Italian, my mother's Black, and he grew up in Southwest Philly when Southwest Philly still had Irish on one side, Black on the other side. Like he was telling me a little bit about that. And he was just telling me a lot
I
about,
remember the brother we met at the Nation.
yeah, he's also, I think, also
Yeah,
Italian.
he's Italian and Black.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting,
Yeah.
but just a very beautiful, super intelligent person of a certain character, not just intelligence, but a certain character.
And discipline.
And discipline. And it just showed me that I feel like, because I've been seeing more, usually the members I meet are women, because in healthcare, to a certain extent, you'll meet a lot of women who work in healthcare. But more and more, I'm seeing more and more men, especially of the Gen X generation, you know, maybe older millennials, Gen X, who are at this place in their lives where they're basically both, you know, to a certain extent, assuming leadership in my union, but they're also, I think, looking for, they are the people who would assume leadership in their communities to understand why are things the way they are. And there's something about this moment we're in where I don't know, it struck me and I wanted to share that there seems to be a potential. People are already looking for answers, and we have unity in our explanation for why things are the way they are. And now we're in a moment, maybe this is what we're talking about, we're looking for a certain unity in struggle, in real active struggle of the people taking more and more of what we consider to be power in this city, like let's just say Philly. But there's something about the Gen X generation. I'm calling them Gen X. Maybe they're technically older millennials, but that age, basically the people who were born in 70s, 80s, 90s, the thing that they seem to all have in common is, like, there's another man, Anthony, who we were talking about, and he was explaining to me music in the 80s because that's my big blind spot for some reason. But he said the same thing that this other man said. He was like, I'm very interested in explaining the 70s, 80s, 90s. He called them the killer decades. And I was like, oh, what do you mean by that? Yeah, he was like, I called them the killer decades. First came heroin in the 70s, then came crack. And then the 90s was incarceration. And it's kind of interesting the way people are organically, they're defining the times because we're looking for a way out. And the last thing I just wanted to say is, again, I'm sorry, I'm just bringing up a lot of things I ended up doing this past week because I had a really busy work schedule, and some of it already kind of made me, I was thinking of things that I wanted to bring to free school, but I had to go to this communications conference for my work. It was held, a national communications conference was held in Philly, and I went to a workshop where they were explaining where is the working class going. Like, everyone's interested in how it's, but what they mean is they're not talking about where is the working class going. They're interested in how is the working class voting. And what I was going to tell you earlier when we were still talking was, people are always like, oh, how are people voting? When they don't understand that people not voting or being not interested in voting is the biggest vote of all. An unparticipation in the system, a rejection of the system, like you phrased it, Doc. But it was interesting because the Working Families Party, which is this big, they're calling themselves a third party, but they're really just part of the Democratic Party to try to lead people back into the Democratic Party, is these are professionals who are doing full-time polling across the country. And they divided up the working class into what they called clusters. And it was so interesting because clusters, working class clusters. And I was so intrigued by the way they were, because what we do is we're always talking about how do we scientifically analyze the people, how the people feel, how the people reacting to war, reacting to poverty, reacting to a crisis of legitimacy of governance. And I feel like we analyze it different, but it was so interesting because they divided the working class clusters into 14% are next gen left, 13% are mainstream liberals, 13% are core MAGA, 14% are anti-woke traditionalists, 14% are secure suburbanites, 16% are diverse, disaffected conservatives, and then 16% are tuned out persuadables. 16%.
So it's 6 groups, almost all equal in size, but all fragmented across those categories.
Exactly. And they even divided it up by these are the job classes they have. Healthcare workers in this category, truck drivers in that category, like office admin, this category. And they even had like, this is the types of news sources they listen to. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, how weird it is that people, because there's power in them even putting out a framework of how to even understand or see human beings, our fellow people, that I find to be very inaccurate and a misunderstanding of what people are really, people cannot be just determined by, if you have this job class, you will think this, or if you, and you will listen to this news, or you will vote this way. People, it's like a complete misunderstanding of really like how are people historically, because after the assassination of King, after the state's active agenda of incarceration against the people, against poor people, how are people responding to their own family histories? You know, there's also a complete missing category of the way white supremacy, and whether you want to be white or whether you know that you are not white, like how that shapes people's consciousness. But anyways, I just thought that was also interesting. But what it also showed me was that everyone is seeking answers. For everyone, including these paid professionals, know that for the first time it feels like the people are scattered, because the people, they're not just sheep, and they're not sheep just following like any leader to a massacre anymore. I think people have a sense that the people are so dissatisfied that there's no guarantee of, and this group of people following XYZ, people are looking for teachings. But, oh, sorry, the one last thing I want to say is, last night Nuri and I went to this play in West Philly called Acknowledge Me.
Oh, really? How was it?
It was okay. Well, the interesting part was, so this play, it was by Theater in the X, and it's a West Philly-based Black theater company, which I think does really great work. And they made this play off of community discussions over the past 2 years, based upon what people in the community were concerned about, or the conversations that were happening. So the real interesting part of the play was trying to get a sense of, oh, the community must have had a conversation about like African immigrants versus African Americans, because that played a role in the play. Or incarceration was clear, or how are Black people responding to ICE? Or like, how much do we owe Native Americans? So like, it was clear that there must have been a lot. But the thing I paid attention to was they kept repeating this phrase. It was about a fracture in generations, where like the parents' generation had passed away. And now this younger generation of young people who now are taking responsibility for not just their lives, but for, are we gonna be able to hold on to our home? Like the home being a concrete, like, are we gonna be able to stay in this neighborhood? And basically, to me, I also read the subliminal message as being, we are a generation in need, looking for moral guidance. The moral guidance that is even behind political decisions, existential decisions, concrete financial decisions. We're looking for the moral guidance, the moral truth behind all this. And that there is no such thing as just political decisions that are not based in moral truth, or a moral fabric that explains my relationship to myself and other people. And there was a line that kept repeating where this little sister was telling her older brother, who was making difficult decisions, like in some ways immoral decisions. She said, remember what Dad said, all money is not good money. And it was kind of, to me, I read the play as like, beneath what must have been community discussions, it was people in the concrete asking, where is our moral compass? Especially with generations passing away. What is the moral center again, behind even political decisions, behind even like financial decisions? And yeah, I found that play to be interesting in that aspect. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, on the point of, I just have a small point to make, which is on the point of the state's responsibility to the people, which you brought up, Emily. I was reminded of that article that you were referencing in the Financial Times.
Ed Luce.
By Edward Luce, where he's trying to figure out why these young Gen Z, Gen X people are leaning socialist, and his idea is that look at them, look at people like Zoran Mamdani and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and then this other guy James Tallarico. They are so-called like they proclaim themselves to be socialist, and they implement policies that's, also on the surface sound really nice. And that's why there is a group of people amongst the youth who are going towards whatever they're trying to do. But I think what I found very lacking in the article, and I couldn't, the Financial Times has made up its mind about this, but I think that the people are also looking at a country like China, and they are seeing that they have surpassed the United States in a lot of different fields with respect to uplifting their people out of poverty and giving them a good life, a standard of living. And I think that with the internet and everything and all the information about China, I think with all the propaganda of the New York Times and the Financial Times, they can still see through it. They can still see that China is sort of developing in a rapid way, even though they are socialist. And like I saw this article in the New York Times, which was saying that China is rapidly progressing in the fields of biotechnology, that they are that they have drugs in clinical trials that are going to eradicate diseases that have plagued us for years. And but the central point of the article was that what is the US going to do to stop this? That it is threatening our economy, our markets, and if China is going to rise above the US in terms of their biotechnological developments, what does it mean for the United States? So, their framework or their vision is very centered towards the protection of the US state. Their question is not, oh, this is a technology that exists now, how many people can that save? How many people are going to be affected by this new technology that can give them new life? That's not their question. And I feel like the people are rejecting that as well. The people are rejecting this idea of protecting the state and over the lives of the people. And there was another thing in the article that I wanted to ask everybody's opinion about. One of the things that Edward Luce states is that this generation is more likely to employ violence to overthrow the state or get what it wants more than the previous generations. Now, I was thinking about that, and it's also an open question to everyone. That what do we think of that? People below the age of 30, that's the youth category that he's defined. Are they more likely to pick up a gun and overthrow the state than any time in history?
Well, the poll is not are they going to use violence, but the poll is do they approve of the use of violence, which I think is slightly different. Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to pick up a gun, as opposed to saying that I'm okay with violence being used, even if it's a cause I believe in.
I could read this wrong, but the way I see that is not so much a desire for violence, but a frustration and desperation with a system that no longer works, and that has showed that through elections, change is not possible.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the student protests around Palestine and how for weeks and months that they were of a very non-violent nature. And if that's why I kind of really suspected that statement in that article, that are we more approving of violence for social change and revolution? Because of all of the examples that we've seen in modern times of student movements, they have been largely nonviolent.
I just wanted to say a couple things that I know we want to transition over to Michelle and Albert sharing about their time in China, but just to go back to some of the things you had mentioned, Doc, or even some of the things from this conversation. I mean, yeah, just to pick up on this theme, I think that Sister Tuera had started with this idea of like, what we really need are teachers to be able to, like, a leader must also be able to teach somebody in as part of, this practice of both humility, but also like what we're talking about in terms of actually gaining clarity around what it means to make sense of our times today. Like, that's what I just wanted to appreciate about Doc, the way you talked about not just the way, making sense of Assata and the many Assatas, but also even the kinds of ways in which young people who read her autobiography and experience a certain kind of transformation, they're yearning for some kind of, path out, or like a revolutionary path. I know the title of today's discussion was Assata's Search for Revolutionary Truth. I think there's a way in which our conversation has really built out this idea, what does it mean for the people to reach, or even especially young people, a level of revolutionary truth that allows them to come together and understand their role in history and understand the struggle that they're up against, which will come, I think, from people searching and wanting to find certain lessons, both in that decade, those decades, and even in life of someone like Assata, but also this larger question of like, what really are the paths towards revolutionary movements or unity? And I feel that, or those models that we were talking about. And it just made me think about how I remember coming up also, and it reminded me so much of how other students when I was in college were reading like Assata's autobiography. I know I was very influenced by even Assata, or even like the image of her, or even like her going to Cuba, that it was one of those reasons that were like, inspired me to think about like, taking a study abroad semester in Cuba as part of a lot of questions I was answering if I was still dissatisfied with my education in the US, or even the whispers of, people like, have you read this book, or have you thought about Cuba? Have you thought about like this connection between Fidel and Malcolm X? And then getting there, and one, I think actually appreciated the way you talked about how the model of, the Cuban Communist Party is like higher education school for their party members, and then realizing like, there's a certain image, I think, of even in the Cuban Revolution as this armed guerrilla struggle that I think, feels very compatible for many people with like an armed struggle. I mean, we talk about this all the time, like a path of liberation struggles that, like we're done by the gun, we're done by, taking up arms against a colonizing or imperialistic force, which I think made sense as a way to, understand the path that the Vietnamese struggle had to go through, or at a certain stage of the Cuban Revolution had to go through. But to actually see this longer term, like decades-long project to actually transform social relationships, and even who the center of a new Cuban society would be, no longer the casino owners, but actually the child. And to be able to, I mean, we talk so much about the literacy program, but I just wanted to say like that also was so interesting when I was there, that actually that's when a lot of my fellow cohort members, we had downloaded and traded amongst each other. We didn't have a copy of the book, but we shared the PDF of the autobiography with a lot of people, because we were very interested in like knowing who else had come from, I guess, like, America, but especially Black America, to Cuba to find. I think this very, to appreciate the Cuban Revolution, what you're talking about in terms of Fidel. And it was really interesting. There was actually another woman that had also been part of, I think, the Republic of New Africa, who had sought refuge in Cuba. I think her name is Nehanda Abiodun.
Abiodun.
Yeah. It was really funny because I finally asked my host family, who was actually just a 78-year-old grandmother, actually a Black woman who had gone to law school, actually, because of the, I think, changes after the Cuban Revolution. Like,
do you maybe know Assata Shakur? And she was thought about really hard. She's like, that name sounds familiar, but I think I know a different woman. I used to like be friends with her, and I was like, but she passed away this year. And I looked and was like, I don't think Assata passed away this year, so who was it? So it turned out to be somebody else. But it's been really interesting to reflect on that in the way in which, I appreciate how you talked about how, it was very courageous for Fidel to always, defend the lives of all these, Black men and women who've come to, or the people who've sought political refuge in Cuba, despite this offer to relieve these sanctions, have only made things very difficult on the island as part of this erosion of, I think, trying to attack the sovereignty, but also even the strength and morale of the Cuban people, especially even as we think about today. I know that there were some new ways in which the U.S. government was trying to discredit or frame Raul Castro in the same way, I think, leading up to Maduro's extradition and kidnapping. They were trying to do that towards his image. But it was really, I remember when we had come to Cuba, I think in 2017, Trump specifically, I think, wanted to reissue an attempt to extradite the cop killer, the Assata Shakur, and it was just really interesting to reflect upon, basically the very long ways in which I think people, as you were saying, that there has been, there are people always in, every generation have a certain love affair with Cuba, but also what really are these longer lessons, as we're seeing, young people become fascinated, increasingly drawn towards, as we're saying, this, I guess, reflected from the polls, this favorability of communism when so many things, the system today in the U.S. has just shown itself to be so poor and it's so understandable in the way that I think, I'm right now starting to supervise a group of 10 young people who are all under the age of 25, more or less, and we had to, as part of a exercise, to get to know one another, because this project that we're working on is about these themes of this artwork whose themes are about freedom from and freedom to. And I decided, we talk about in free school these positive and negative freedoms, and I was just curious about what these young people would say if I gave them a prompt, what would you want to be free from and what would you want to be free to? Most of them, when they had the prompt, I want to be free from, maybe 5 out of 10 of them said capitalism or rent or Trump, but many of them were this, I don't want to be, I want to be free from, I want to be free to think. I want to be free from AI. I want to be free from, the ways of all these different ways in which I think, it's just so interesting to match up to basically how strongly the sentiment of rejection is widespread among young people. But I also share a lot of the same, I guess, questions around what it means for all of this to crystallize and actually become, enter this next stage from, say, rejection or rebellion and into a revolutionary movement where, young people know, also are able to, articulate their role in history and not simply, this thing of destruction that we talk about. So that was just a lot of different, a bit of a mishmash of many things I was thinking about in our conversation. But I know we have to move on towards that source.
Comments?
Oh yeah, we should read some comments from our online listeners.
John Briggs, Shirley, J. Carter, Nathan Reddy, and Bambalai said good morning. And Manifesto said that they didn't know that the United States had given a release sanctions ultimatum to Cuba, that if they turned in Assata Shakur, that they would relax sanctions. Said Cuba has too much integrity to sell out a true revolutionary and fall for the lies of imperialist devils. Ron Fraser pointed out that the Assata Shakur memorial ignored Dhoruba bin Wahad, who we talked about a little bit, I guess as the representative of the Black Liberation Army. Nathan said John Berger's essay on Che, Image of Imperialism, examines the mentality of so-called terrorist or violent resistance. It makes life or death tolerable if you find society intolerable, which I guess maybe is similar to like the concept of revolutionary suicide. And then says, a similar argument could be made about nonviolent resistance. Then says, who's out here saying capitalism is good at this point? Nobody. And then says, but potential leadership seems to be immediately absorbed into electoral politics. Bombalai thinks that Chris Mills is more of a child of the 90s. And then Jupiter Hammond pointed out the Jacobin article on the meteoric rise in narcissistic knowledge of Chris Mills. They thought that the article provided a decent analysis. I feel like we ended up talking about the article a little bit more. Lisa Nojika asks who?
Kashama swore leftist to also wrote a response to the Jacobin article.
Okay, but we didn't really say anything about Kashama. Road to Hell 46, who I think is a new commenter, asks, does this group ever talk about Black leaders who were actually Marxist-Leninist, like W.E.B. Du Bois,
All the time.
or Henry Winston? And Bombalai says, yes, they do. And then Road to Hell rebuts, do they though? I only hear them rehashing MLK and discussing devout anti-communists like James Baldwin. Bombalai says, I agree that I would like to hear more about Henry Winston, Du Bois, and Paul Robeson. And then Jahan, I'll read Jahan's comments first. Jahan says, it may be true that for the state to betray a majority of the youth, that is the greatest violation of the social contract. And thus it has the greatest consequences for the existing crisis of legitimacy. It means that they, like the state, is telling everyone loud and clear that they don't want to give the next generation a better or even stable future. And if they're saying that, that should be untenable for any state. He says, Du Bois, Robeson, and Winston have the courage to move past the dogmas of Marxism and Leninism that existed in the 20th century, and therefore they do become central voices for the 21st century. And their vision leads directly to King and Baldwin for our times. Says, we could argue that the decline and the failure of both the Biden and Trump administrations is a reflection of young people rejecting the duopoly, the two-party system. It's wrecked two successive presidents in a way that we have not seen before. And then Magna says, we need teachers because there are eternal truths at the foundation of civilization. The problem with so many leaders today is that they're disconnected from those original teachings and unable to interpret them for our times, which I think is what you were saying, Emily, that there is a need for like political and ideological leadership, which also is about like education and about teaching. Those are basically the comments. And then Bombalai just said that the capitalist system is trash.
Maybe Albert and Michelle could talk about their trip to China.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So Albert and I were in China for a little bit less than 2 weeks, and it was our first visit there. And what we wanted to present is an organized summary of how we approached this trip, and then what some of our main impressions or findings were that maybe can serve as a foundation for further study of it. And then we're going to end with a recap of a conversation we had with a young Chinese intellectual who's a colleague of Zhang Weiwei's. So Albert and I started preparing for this trip a few months earlier, and we selected one thinker in particular to kind of frame our trip around, who's I think most of us are familiar with. His name is Zhang Weiwei, and he's served as a interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, and then studied for a few decades in Europe. And he's a pretty well-known social scientist to the Chinese people, but also uniquely known to the Western audience because he speaks English very fluently. So the book that we focused on is called The China Wave, and it was published in 2011. And this is kind of a landmark book because he puts forth the theory of the civilizational state in that book. And he himself acknowledges that that book was more of a landmark than he had predicted for the Chinese people. And the way he had approached it was assessing China in the 21st century in a way through a worldview that was separate from that of Western hegemony. And this is something that the Chinese intellectual class was at that time and still is today struggling with, is shaking off the hegemony of that Western worldview as superior. So for example, when that book was translated for an English audience, he deliberately ended it with a transcript of this 2011 debate he had with Francis Fukuyama about the end of history thesis. And he says, because he had to convert the narrative for a Western audience, and he framed that debate as the end of history thesis. So I think that those examples are illustrative of how he was seeing the political task at that moment. And he calls that book a new model of development and a new political discourse. Like these are the ends that he was working out of. That book is a part of an overall trilogy that he wrote that was then succeeded by a 2015 book called The China Horizon, where The China Horizon, where you can see that he has even more confidence in his thesis of China's importance for the 21st century, but is also more deliberately bridging that ideological dialogue between America and China. And so I'll get into this a little bit later when we recap the conversation with his colleague, but he is a prescient thinker at that time. And something that his colleague kept mentioning is that 15 years ago, the majority of Chinese could never have imagined that they would be at the center of the world stage today, or a center of the world stage. So in this book, and you get it even from reading the English version, he's really trying to give the Chinese people a sense of confidence to inherit their world historic task. 15 years ago is 2011. And just to give one example, he spends time talking about the tragedy of the 2008 financial crisis and how this never would have been allowed to happen in China's political and social system. So we approached China with this framework that Zhang Weiwei provided us, which was to see China's remarkable achievements in the last 3 to 4 decades as of world historic significance and as a bearing of fruit for humanity overall. And I think he kind of prepared us to see things that way. So I think to talk a little bit about our impressions, again, like this was Albert and my first trip to China because we're the children of Taiwanese immigrants. And we'll talk about that piece a little bit later as well, but we have prepared for this trip for a long time, like a little bit less than a year, because the original reason we had attended was for my close friend from high school's wedding. And he married a Chinese woman who had come west. And I just knew I would be there because he's like a brother to me. And so we had started planning a year ago, like we made that commitment a year ago. And we decided that we wanted to approach this trip with as much political substance as possible because kind of by chance, we were given the impetus to go to China. And we might not have had the courage to go this early otherwise. But like our impressions were that from the beginning, we felt very free. And this is something that I talk about when I come back from India or when I come back from just leaving the country in general. But I have never felt this free. And within my first few days, I was compelled to look at Huey Newton's Revolutionary Suicide again. Because I remembered that chapter he had written about China. And he talks about visiting, accepting an invitation by the Chinese state to visit China the year preceding Nixon's visit, or maybe preceding Nixon's visit in the same year. And I remember he said that it was more, I forget exactly how he framed it, but he says it was almost like deeper than the sensation of just freedom, but that he was able to witness a modern achievement of a colored people that would really mean something for the future, and bringing that level of liberation to his own consciousness as a Black American. And I think the reason I felt so free almost as soon as I stepped off that plane is one, of course, like because we were no longer in a white nation, but because very clearly we were in a peaceful nation. And it's very broadly talked about at this point, but we really see China as an outstanding example of a peace industrial economy or a peace industrial nation, highly industrialized, highly developed, highly nonviolent, and possessing a very, very strong state that is nonviolent, that serves its people, that loves its people. And this was evident from the very beginning, from the organization of the airport, but then everything else succeeding it. Public infrastructure, the organization of the city, massive cities that are difficult for us to imagine because they scale up so much from American cities. Like, I forget the population of Beijing, maybe it's 20 million, but Shanghai I know is a population of 25 million, and it's the most populous city in China. And so, you know, a weak state would lead to a very chaotic organization of these cities. But what we saw was highly organized, highly functional. And again, like, we just felt so free in a way that is never, like, we can never take for granted that we feel that way in any American city. Like, in our first nights in Beijing, we would step out at night, 9 p.m., 10 p.m., and you don't just see young people out, you see old people out, and they'll be singing or dancing on the street. You'll see entire families that are shopping. You'll see students. I mean, you watch a vibrant social life that is not vulgar. It's something unfamiliar to the American imaginary. And so, like, we could give many examples, but these are just a few. Like, one other thing I wanted to touch on in terms of feeling very free in a society that had liberated itself from the shackles of world imperialism is consumption. Actually, the experience of consumption is very different in China. And it's because, this is my reflection, it's separated from the color line. And of course, there's the problem of material development and very accelerated material development, which China has undergone. And the government or the CPC leadership will say that. But I think we were just so struck by the experience of consumption that is not, basically not malicious or not anti-human. And so, for example, you feel that in these very, very like dense and developed malls that are in the very commercialized areas of Beijing and Shanghai. But they, like, there's not that same obsession with the material. And it's because I think it's because the people have been given the basic, you know, they have enough. And like, I'll give one small anecdote is, I was shopping for clothes one day and the vendor and I had some banter and she said, like, buy a few more shirts, buy a few more pants. And I said, oh, I just want 3 articles of clothing. She was like, no, just get a 4th, you know, it looks great on you. And I said, no, like, I really just want 3. I know, like, what my limit is. And then she completely flipped, you know, she flipped into the civilizational mode and she said, I'm so impressed with you for practicing restraint. Like, you're a very moderate young woman. Like, you know, very Asiatic. She was like, that's very, very good. So you all 3 pieces. It's an experience of consumption that you never experience, for me, in the US. It's just totally non-vulgar and it's non-exploitative. And I'll even connect it to, like, Gandhi a little bit, but his secretary would say that Gandhi was obsessed with the question of, like, the economics of nonviolence, which I would connect to our theory of a peace industrial economy. And he said that in a nonviolent economy, production and consumption happen as closely to one another as possible, but also that consumption is not based on exploitation. And I think we experienced that to a degree in China. And it was very impressive, like, it was very impressionable. So one other note that I wanted to emphasize in terms of what struck us is what mass poverty alleviation has made possible for a society. And how, you know, something in Free School that we've discussed since early on is that the enemy of democracy is not authoritarianism, it's poverty. That's the first enemy. And I think we saw evidence of that in China. In that post the turbulent years of the Cultural Revolution, the leadership chose to really tackle this problem of poverty, then lifting 800 million people out of extreme and regular poverty. And with these experiences of consumption, but also just in our general relations, in general contact with people, whether it was drivers or servers, everything else, like that edge that we always feel of white supremacy in this society was taken off, but also that edge of extreme poverty. And what we felt was that the conditions for a more genuine brotherhood and a more genuine social contact were made possible. So, that's all just to say that we felt freed, like we just felt incredibly free and very humbled and moved just to be seeing all of this. And like, it was very overstimulating, especially in the first few days. But I felt that I was able to think better and to see the world better and to see humanity better.
It's a solid experience.
So the other case I wanted to make is that what we saw in our visit was China's very advanced concept of humanity, which is a very advanced concept of civilization. And I think that we did not expect how deeply we would be embraced by the Chinese people. I think they struck us as a very sweet people, as a very moral people. And again, like, I think this is partly because China is not a white nation. And so having, been allowed to develop separate from some of the worst evils of colonialism and imperialism, the people, and also having a massive population, 1.5 billion, have just retained a lot of that pure character of like moral goodness and being able to be sweet without it being, again, kind of like a vulgar thing like it would be in the US, where sweetness is often like associated with innocence or ignoring like the reality of white supremacy. But I think we felt like they really treated us as a part of the human family. And to an extent, this is because we're Chinese, but to another extent, it's also just because we're human. And there were several instances where we met people across different parts of society who would just really warmly say to us, like, when you have the chance, come home more often. And this moved us deeply because they could also identify our accents as non-mainland, because Albert and I both have very Taiwan-leading accents. And that made them love us even more because they basically saw us as pilgrims of peace. And we didn't meet a single Chinese person who was not ready to embrace us as a part of this great human experiment, So, one thing I also want to add here is I think that I was also able to better understand many of the people that I grew up with. I mean, like almost everyone here knows, like we grew up around a lot of Asians, and East Asians especially. And where we come from was originally the most densely populated region of Taiwanese immigrants. Today, it's much more mainland Chinese immigrants. And so we did grow up with some people who were first generation from China, and we always called them fogs, and we teased them. And we also loved them, like we were very friendly. But, we had more contact with more Asians in college, and then, just like forever thinking through this Asian question and what the task of the Asian in the West will be. But I felt that we were better able to understand the aspirations of some of these Chinese who come west. And I say this also because my friend's now wife is one of these Chinese. And I think when I was more immature, I would have judged her for being like a bourgeois Chinese and for coming west to become white. I think having actual contact with more of these people and speaking with them gave me more conviction that honestly, my hypothesis is that many of them are searching for colored modernity. They're searching to become modern in a way that ideally is compatible with their Asiatic upbringing, which I would contend is only Black civilization, is incompatible with white civilization. So I say this based on some of our observations, but I also wanted to emphasize, like, Zhang Weiwei talks about this experience of the Chinese youth confronting modernity in some of his writings, and he'll describe the young generation as almost like an oddly nostalgic generation. And what I interpret this as is a generation that has come up in the rapid material and industrial achievements of China in a very short amount of time. But of course, like having lost something in terms of the spiritual or the civilizational in that extremely rapid development. He'll even describe that reach for the Chinese youth back toward the rule, and especially that trek that many of them make during, Lunar New Year, which is a very big event in China, to go home, But I thought about that idea of nostalgia a lot because I think we also confronted it in some of the young art and just the young personalities of the Chinese, which reminded me of some Taiwanese youth that I've met before. But like, I thought of nostalgia a lot because I don't think of the American people or the American youth as a nostalgic people. And it's because I think that through the Black tradition, as Americans, we have a road to the future that also integrates the past. Whereas I see the Chinese people or the Chinese youth as still kind of trying to bridge this rapid, leap from the past into the future. And I say this because if we were extremely impressed with China's very just like one beating heart of civilization, a fifth of the world's population, seeing that in the concrete every day. At the same time, I was constantly thinking about how the gift of America, the gift of Black civilization, is that advanced concept of the human being. And the human being at the vanguard of history, but also the human being as possessing infinite potential and infinite worth for really making a social contribution. And that's what I mean when I say that, despite China's rise, many young educated Chinese are still drawn in by the West and will come westward. I think their role has changed. And I think what they're searching for has and will change. And I think they're searching to an extent for that advanced concept of the human being. I mean, they will literally say this, I crave the freedom and independence and creativity that Americans need to embody. It is a very homogenous society that has its strengths. I also think it has its I think it also has its, I don't want to say weaknesses, but there's room for more development, with that society being constituted the way it is. So for the last portion, I kind of want to speak about the conversation with Ivy and then some notes about the future, but I went through it kind of quickly, so did you want to add anything about the impressions?
Maybe just a few little things, which is, maybe just a few little things I would add. Nothing majorly significant, but even the infrastructure, like the organization of space in China has a very, I guess in Chinese we would say like feng shui, like the society feels very healthy.
Yeah.
Like the buses and the cars don't it's not chaotic where they have to merge in front of each other. Like everything is very organized, and it's not order for order's sake, but rather order for public peace, for the peace of the people. think that's the one thing I would add to it.
Yeah, I know like several of us have been to China, so I think like if there are observations you guys want to add, we should. Like, I don't know if I've depicted it well, but it was an affront to my imagination to see all of this for the first time. So for the last,
an affront.
I think that again, as we've discussed this year, violence is so embedded in the American assumption.
Yes.
And even when we're talking about the attraction to figures like Assata Shakur or the whole canon of Black Power, it comes from this subliminal response to the chaos of the counter-revolution, the chaos of urban life, as wanting to be like essentially a violent rejection.
Right.
I think all of that stops you from thinking about what is the creative alternative, which obviously must be on the basis of peace, because that's what that is the natural order of the human being. And that's very obvious in a country like China, you know? China is a peaceful nation. The people are a civilized, peaceful people. That's normal when you don't have to live under the constant assault of white supremacy.
Right.
And again, like I remember so clearly this line from Rawson, and I think it's from the book that Emily had recommended, where he says, my fear is not like people's ability to struggle. I forget exactly how he said it, but he said, my fear is that the American people will lose their creative pulse toward all of the alternatives to struggle, most of which are violent, that people have inherited. I mean, if your goal is the reconstruction of a nation, that demands a rich imaginary. And I would say that what we've called the Black freedom imaginary or the Black imaginary has much to contribute to that, even for the Chinese projects.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Michelle, that I think you did an incredibly beautiful job encapsulating from the, like, us as children of Asian Chinese immigrants going back and being so astounded by this alternative. You did such a beautiful and perfect job encapsulating it, especially talking about civilization, because, and then even what you just said about, unless you leave this country, it is extremely hard to understand just how much this country so uniquely carved and suppressed and divided by this so-called race, by white supremacy. You don't realize how much it not just debases all human beings, but how much it psychologically breaks you down. And the way you describe that, like, the man I was talking about earlier, who was the union member who's incarcerated for 28 years. The reason why I brought up that he was like, so many of the books I was reading that I remember, Assata, George Jackson, all these political prisoners. What he was basically saying was that he was looking for someone to explain a reaction against a white supremacist incarceral system. And in some ways, what you're also saying is there must be an antidote. There must be an antidote to this rabid white supremacist system that is not just replicating the same violence that it wants to perpetuate in us as human beings. And there's something just so moving about the way you were describing your impressions in China. And well, first of all, I want to commend that you just have such a special gift of speaking in this language. Like, you just have a really special gift of being able to embody something in this language. And you were bringing me back to like my moment. I'm getting emotional, but you're bringing me back to, my moment too, of realizing that this place that the West wanted me to hate was actually my living contribution in my blood, in my ancestry. And I did just want to say that I found it so important for you to bring up civilization, character. I love the way you said, in the East, in China, let's just say, it is a place where human qualities like sweetness, rather being associated with immature innocence, naivete, it is seen as actually advanced consciousness. To be sweet, to be kind, to be good. And In America, let's just say Philly. I hate to say it, but in Philly, sometimes if you're too sweet, it means that people get rough with you. People think you're naive. When you're earnest, people punish you. When you're too pure, you're punished. Too friendly, punished. And it's not just Philly. It's because we live in such the way things are set up for us is, we're put under conditions where we interpret things like that. We interpret rudeness as normal. And I just wanted to say, I don't know if you felt the same way now that you've for coming back, but the only place I felt that type of freeness, the only closest place I felt it in the US was actually when I went to Mos 12. And I say that all the time, and I remember saying it to Brother Jabril, and he was really confused. And the only time I ever felt free, anything close, was actually the Nation of Islam. And the reason why is because of that level of character. Sweetness. It was the only place where I felt like sweetness was seen as advanced, not sweetness seen as, oh, let me bully you now. And that was the only place that I experienced that in this country.
I think to finish, we'll recap some of a meeting that we had in Shanghai on our second week. And we were introduced to this young woman. She's either in her late 30s or early 40s, named Ivy. And she's a colleague of Zhang Weiwei. So I think this is grounds for further exploration, but it's very significant to Zhang Weiwei's ideological and political development that he was essentially mentored by Deng Xiaoping. Let's talk about it. But he served as a foreign translator, which is a very prestigious position that only a few dozen Chinese served, for an entire decade. And Deng Xiaoping was that leader that steered China out of chaos after the Cultural Revolution, and that we, have credited with a lot of China's stability and prosperity in the 21st century. I would say that Ivy is essentially mentored by Zhang Weiwei, who is 67 years old today. And so she's closer to our generation. And we were introduced to her by Nandita and Raju because our colleagues from India have done some work with both Ivy and Zhang Weiwei on the India and China unity question. So I'll preface this by saying that, again, Beijing was very stimulating, it was very overwhelming, and it definitely took us time and also reading to try to make sense of some of this. I think by the time we got to Shanghai on our second week, we were dying to talk with someone who could kind of explain all of this from the inside. And we prepared ourselves, especially with Du Boisian sociology. And we really wanted to understand how she saw the Chinese situation and the Chinese people. And she left us with essentially gold, just so much to think about. And we trusted her. So the way that we had introduced ourselves was really as young people dedicated to the peace question and dedicated to the struggle against colonialism and imperialism and white supremacy. And she said from the beginning, I see us as working for the same purposes. So we were impressed by her consciousness. She's not just an ordinary person, she's a political agent. And to give a little bit of background, Zhang Weiwei, he's either the leader or in a leadership position of the China Institute, which is a think tank based at Fudan University, one of the most prestigious universities in Shanghai. And the China Institute has really taken up this question of the civilization state and the China model. So a model of social development or national development that is not based off the Western bourgeois liberal order, that is, separate from the worldview of a Fukuyama. Ivy works with a group called the China Academy, which is essentially a media arm of the China Institute, which is a leading ideological institution. And within that, the Thinkers Forum, which is another ideological offshoot from the China Institute. She works among and with young people especially. So we began by introducing who we were as Americans and as members of the Free School. And it was very, I mean, I think many of us have had this experience. It's not always easy to explain the free school to outsiders and to use political language. It's just not, you know, because it's not common that we encounter a group like this in the US. It was very natural for us to see our work, and we introduced ourselves as respective groups in the ideological struggle that were working on creating the conditions for a cultural renaissance of our people. At the same time, we were also talking with the objective of us being one people, a part of the human family, and hence needing to explain the Chinese situation and the American situation to one another. Just like she gave us glimpses into China's ideological and historical development at this stage that we could never have understood as outsiders otherwise, we did the same for her. And we were able to do that because of our worldview in free school. So I just want to touch on a couple of significant points from that conversation. And one of them is that, you know, we began to see the special role of Zhang Weiwei in Chinese society and in the world ideological political situation. We kind of began with him as by chance, and also because there aren't many Chinese thinkers that write for a Western audience, even in 2026, you know. I think that China, for me, and I think this is a fairly common experience, though there is more informal contact between the Chinese and American people today, it's still difficult, like with there being, I guess what people call the Great Firewall, and like also the huge linguistic difference and the huge difference in worldview. I mean, I yearn for more contact with the Chinese people in a way that I just don't think I could have achieved at this stage without going to China myself. I think he's special because he's crossed that divide, and he crossed it very early on. And I want to bring up again Ivy's point. She said it multiple times in the conversation. 15 years ago, the majority of the Chinese people could not have conceived that they would surpass the West in most economic, political, and social development. And hence, the question for the Chinese people today is, having risen to the stage of world history, what is our task? And that's exactly the question that they operate out of ideologically. She described how there was an ideological void that was created after the Cultural Revolution, which traumatized a generation, and then the 2 decades of economic development with a de-emphasis on ideological development. And hence, like, there being a severe need for answering the burning questions of China's future for the world in this time. So Weiwei is a leading thinker within that context. And that's why I also say that I see this group that she's working in as having been mentored through his worldview. She also brought up a few good points that I had never considered, but she said that Weiwei, especially in his early years when he put forth the thesis of the civilizational state, was heavily criticized by the Chinese intellectual class. Kind of the way that our colleagues in India have made an assessment of the Indian intellectual elite, I saw that pattern in the Chinese elite based on what she was describing. She also made some very interesting points that the most resistance to Weiwei comes from the middle tier of the CPC, but his worldview is very aligned with the upper tier of the CPC. For example, it's been cited publicly that Xi Jinping has suggested his works as like suggested reading for the CPC leadership. So she basically made this point that Weiwei had an unnatural courage and an unnatural addiction to the truth, essentially, that allowed him to make this thesis very strong early on. The reason he got so much pushback is because the Chinese intellectual class, having so much come of age in a time when the Western intellectual class really had a stronghold on the world, and had also put down China, that Chinese intellectuals feeling that they must come less and that they're inferior to the white man. I mean, he was struggling against all of that. And I think that his position that essentially China would surpass the West was an existential challenge to the way that many Chinese intellectuals saw China's development in the 21st century. She credits, and I think I credit, a lot of his courage and his ideological courage, his ideological like foresight to the influence of Deng Xiaoping. I think that I have like had trouble understanding Deng Xiaoping and also need to understand him better. But I think that his influence on Zhang Weiwei was that he had to be ideologically creative enough, totally undogmatic enough to steer a nation out of chaos into its first serious stage of reconstruction. And she said, though their years working together were very short, it made a forever impression on him. I will also say, like, he studied international relations in Switzerland after serving as foreign translator, and he was 30 years old when he went, studied for 6 years. And at the end, he worked on a landmark study that I still want to read better, and I think we should look at it. But it's essentially, from what I understand, a crystallization of his own political experiences in China that then lead him to, you know, so confidently say China's achievements may be the most important world historic event of the 21st century. And she said something that I had never known, which is that in order to complete that thesis, he returned to China to make a sociological survey of the Chinese worker. And I'm actually still looking for evidence of this because I didn't find it in the original thesis, but I think we should look at that if it's there, because it's highly complementary with our own sociological study. The consciousness of the Black worker as the agent of democracy and world democracy. I see the impressions of that. Which I see as a landmark in our first discovery as a collective of the significance of China to the American people and the world. It's just an incredibly beautiful space. But I did want to emphasize one thing, which is that in this narrative that Xi Jinping and the CPC leadership have been chiseling out for the people, and again, this is where they lean on a thinker like Zhang Weiwei, the narrative, the ideological narrative for the Chinese people to understand their world historic task. I saw this phrase emphasized over and over, which is China as an anti-feudal, anti-colonial nation. China having made great contributions to the anti-feudal struggle, overthrowing the dynastic era, into the anti-colonial struggle, overthrowing Japanese and British oppression. And I say this because really what we left China with is an impression that we see the Chinese people as on the journey to becoming a darker nation. The way that we describe, for example, the ideal of a Cuba. For example, something Ivy had also told us was the Chinese youth's frustration with Beijing not taking a stronger stand on the genocide in Gaza. And from what I can understand, the Chinese youth possess a very special consciousness to grow up in a time where they truly do not need to look down on themselves as inferior to the white man for any reason whatsoever. like we're seeing a full moral, civilizational, intellectual force at play among an entire generation at this point. And we saw some of that reflected. But China is not a white nation. I wouldn't call it a black nation, but I saw the people's aspirations in reaching for, again, that colored modernity. And what I would say is at best that Kingian vision, that vision of Martin Luther King Jr. in the 21st century, a way to make a contribution to humanity, to achieve democracy in the Black imaginary, not just democracy in material form, on behalf of the world. So I think moving forward, honestly, I feel that the American people need something like the vitality of the Chinese people. And with there being continued and increased ideological contact between China and America, and especially the younger generations, I think our unity is indispensable. And so we wanted to bring fruit back to free school through our visit. And our hope is that we've set a foundation that we can really build from. And with Ivy, the meeting ended really well. And she wanted to introduce us to more young Chinese thinkers even younger than her, who truly came up in that most revolutionary period. We're going to work on a written interview with Zhang Weiwei.
Nice.
And you didn't know that. and that appetite for genuine unity is very present and alive between the Chinese and the American people. I think we have to be a part of that.
I think just a few things I would add would be, in our conversation with Ivy, when Michelle had brought up peace and nonviolence through the free schools method of Du Boisian science, or through the Kingian revolution, I guess. Like Michelle said, she really perked up. And then she said this thing that we really remember is that she said, the Chinese people are highly compatible with equality and peace and nonviolence. And I just agree again that, and this is something that I had spoken to with Jahan about too, is that the Chinese people are fertile and ripe for more contact with what we would consider true America, or like the truly striving America, the Black freedom movement. And they're ready to know and take on this task of becoming one people. That's it.
Just one more thing is, we've read some propaganda or some statements from CPC leadership before, and I always found it difficult to interpret. Even simple concepts like moderate prosperity or things like that, to want to become a nation of moderate prosperity. I feel like we were better able to understand some of this language, and especially actually like the idea of the human family or family, because this is what I'm trying to get at when I say that we were welcomed as family. And again, I don't think it's just because we were Asian. We felt so natural in our relationship to the Chinese people. And I understand better now. Even something like the Belt and Road Initiative, really as a civilizational endeavor, family as a deeply civilizational concept. And I agree with Emily's emphasis that if you want to see civilization in the concrete, China, India, and that's still the Asiatic gift to the future. Black America, just things that are easy to lose in the American imaginary. All of this gives you vitality again to see clearly.
What was Ivy's analysis of the American situation and the American people?
Well, Ivy said something interesting, which is I think they might be a team of like 10 or 20 who I see as not that different from the free school, in the sense that they're ahead of their generation for really taking up this question of what will the Chinese dream be defined as, and having achieved an economic promise what will the human or the democratic promise of the Chinese people be? And she said that almost everyone in that institution had had some education in the West, been disillusioned with it, and came back to China, seeing this as their project. So she didn't give an analysis of the American, actually she did say some things, not a close analysis of the American people, but I think that essentially they're not able to understand it fully because they don't see the Black community or Black civilization. And we actually dedicated a majority of our conversation to explaining our worldview and why we see Black civilization as the promise of American civilization. And we actually gifted her 3 books, 1 King, 1 Baldwin, and 1 Du Bois. And she was so sweet in how she received it. She was like, I've never read any of these. I was like, well, you guys should. I think there's a chaos to the American situation that is difficult for the Chinese mind to interpret. And they might think that the Trump phenomenon is humorous or baffling, but it's not enough. And that's where free schools analysis is very important, because we can explain the science behind these events.
Right.
You said the nature of peace with the Asian people, it gels together. And it's because there is a separation from Western culture. And I just wanted to say, in the Nation of Islam, we're taught that all the original people, the nature is righteousness.
Yes.
So when you said that, it was confirmation that once there is a separation of ideas, and you can be yourself. And the other thing that Master Farah Muhammad taught Elijah Muhammad, he said the greatest subject that he wanted him to teach all of us was to accept your own and be yourself. So accepting that righteous nature, you can be at peace with yourself, your people, and the world, and not rejecting who you are and what gels with your nature for you to have that joy and happiness and that advancement. And I think you came back with the proof that being in that nature will allow, China has allowed China to progress and surpass America in all subjects in, biotechnology, which you were talking about earlier. So it's a great example of that being possible.
Yes.
Well, I think what you all have done here today has been really beautiful.
Yeah.
I have to admit it. And I was just sitting here thinking that I think, you all just laid out the foundations of a book.
Wow.
It's so much.
The American way, the American horizon.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
the China.
Well, no, actually, it reminded me, when you were talking, it reminded me of Du Bois's book, Russia and America. Because even what you were saying at the end, Michelle, was about, in some ways, China has reached a place that America, in terms of objective conditions, America has just laid in for too long as a nation. You've technically achieved a certain economic standard of living in terms of industrialization, but your people are so poor. And in China has developed enough to reach a certain level of industrialization, but here comes that stage where all people must address, which is the human democratic moral questions. That is kind of like, if there's this common destiny of the world's peoples to reach that peak of that mountain, to answer that highest question of, but what is really what is now the human achievement, the human democratic answer? Like, now that we've been able to raise the economy a certain level, there's you're able to actually provide materially for most people, at least have those means of providing for the people. But America has been unable to do anything with that question, and here we are reaping what we sow today. And yes, I love the way you, it just shows that what you're saying, the American people the Chinese people and the world's people have this common destiny, a
Yeah.
common,
Yeah.
we'll reach the same common modern questions. And we need each other rather than like, the human beings will need to answer those questions. And in some ways, I don't know, I just find it to be an antidote to the opposite, which is like the color line. But.
Because it's in Russia and America when Du Bois is talking about his visits to China, where he says, I think the line is, maybe the riddle of the universe will be solved in China. No, I thought it was in China. Yeah, I think it's like when he's talking about what it was like to experience, like, it was in Russia and America, but he's talking about China. And he's like, there is nothing that I've experienced that compares to going to, like, I think it's Beijing, I think.
Yeah.
And like, he's like, oh, this is really what humanity means.
Yes.
It's like that ocean of humanity. And yeah, it made me want to read more Zhang Weiwei, for sure. And because I think I even have this habit, I feel like you kind of sometimes need to turn to like Western intellectuals to like get affirmation about the world. So like someone that I've looked at a lot recently is Adam Tooze, the economist, who is like thinking a lot and writing a lot about China right now. And like his way of saying it is that he's like, the entire history of essentially the modern industrial world, including the first industrial revolution all the way up until the present, all of that has been a prelude to China. And he's like, China is the story of modern history. And it's not just a sequel, but it's like, if you look at it even in plain economic terms, it's like, he's like, there's nothing that has actually compared to what China has achieved. And I think even in those terms, it's like, it's something that I think it's like most Americans, like you were saying yourself, like most Americans really struggle to even comprehend it. In part because of the white supremacist assumptions that are baked in of like, oh, it's not possible for non-white people to progress beyond us. But I think even in terms of, like I don't know actually like how Chinese people themselves has made sense of even what they've experienced. And I think that like basically this century itself will be in large part building upon like all of these great strides which have been made, and humanity, like all of humanity, like being able to in some way like experience that together and to learn from it together, I think is part of the journey that we see ourselves on and wanting to be part of and wanting to like you were saying, to build those bridges. I think it's like for someone who's like never been to China and only seen kind of both from the media and then also like even peripherally, like because we recently went to South Korea, it's like you can see parts of it, but I think to be able to like have some sense of the whole, to be able to grasp some sense of the whole, I think that in itself is like an ideological task and an achievement. I think that definitely not the American, like not enough Americans are thinking about, but there's a lot.
I wanted to say something that Ivy talked about in the beginning of the conversation was how they were discouraged when they first began their ideological project as the China Academy.
Oh, wow.
And they were discouraged because they were told, I forget by who, but like,
the
oh,
owner of like a major media platform.
They said Chinese people are not interested in politics. Like they've gotten their fill and they don't really need to question further. And she had such a remarkable way of responding. I think this is the influence of Zhang Weiwei. She like kind of cocked her head and she was like, but we didn't quite feel that was true. And now they've amassed like a tremendous following, you know, and they're I think they're a leading ideological force that's taking on the same questions that we are for the Chinese people.
Yeah.
And they found that appetite, a deep hunger among the Chinese youth to know who are we going to become? The world is looking to us.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say, part of the reason we wanted to really emphasize the role of the American people and Black civilization in particular to her is because Danny Haifeng and Zhang Weiwei have a political relationship. And even shortly before we met with Ivy, Danny Haifeng released an interview with Zhang Weiwei. And I just think it's a really tired discourse at this point of like, China has surpassed America and America has nothing to offer, which is Danny Haifeng's position. You know, he's an apologist. I mean, at the end of the day, you're an apologist for white supremacy. And we were actually really discouraged at first because we requested an in-person interview with him and it was declined because he's very busy and he has many interview requests at this point. But something that we have made clear and Ivy knows is like, we have something in the way we see the world that few people have, and that we see history as being driven from a new place. And if Danny Haifeng is speaking on behalf of the American people, like I say this with love, but I mean we have to make an intervention. It's just if that's the bridge between China and America, it can't be.
Do you think? Because I've only interacted with the English language faces of like the China Academy and the various media outlets that have. Do they see their audience as primarily Chinese people, or is it like both international and Chinese?
I'm not totally sure. I do know that they definitely pursue an international audience, but I know they also are a leading force like among the Chinese people. It might be something like the Thinkers Forum within it, like speaks, kind of bridges more dialogue between China and the world.
I was just gonna say that there was some time when we were really interested in Zhang Weiwei that I had found his, it was these videos uploaded to YouTube, but I think I don't know if it's still ongoing, but he has like a weekly talk show. And there's actually maybe a Chinese language talk show that I think is podcasted from like one of the CCTVs, China Central TV. Yeah, and so like the topics were always really interesting. This is more in 2022 that I was like following that and listening to that. Like it'd be about the Ukraine war on one day, like it'd be about like the Soviet Union's collapse the next day, it would be like the American situation the next day. So it's like a weekly. I don't know if they still do it, but I think to me it showed that like Zhang Weiwei is really interested in being able to speak to the domestic audience as well, but the format and like who's actually even seeing that is so different. But I also just want to say I think it's really tremendous that the two of you have also made this a very political effort to open all these channels of dialogue, but also like avenues to be able to, as you're saying, like show that the American people like have something to learn from the Chinese people, but also there is actually something really important, not just to recycle, as we're saying, around like these like leftist narratives that end up, obviously praising China in a certain way, but really downplaying like any kind of revolutionary future for the American people, or even like basically, taking the option of like, principled relationships between China and the U.S., like even in this like, from even knowing, the fruits of even the Black freedom struggle, not even like the sort of like the great legacy of like someone like Huey Newton, but actually like what is even the King legacy in the way in which like the American people can actually make, a principled intervention in like, the path for peace today.
One of the reasons why I asked is because I think something because Westerners have that image of the homogeneity of China, that I think it's really easy to underestimate how rich and also like actually diverse the intellectual and ideological landscape is like within China. But it's like, we don't see it, like at least we don't see it because it's all in China, it's all happening there organically. But I think I brought it up because I've noticed there's a certain narrative, because you're getting a lot of like books these days about like people trying to explain China, explain China's rise. There's this book that came out by this guy named Dan Wang recently called Breakneck. which is about basically saying that China is an engineering state, whereas the US is a lawyer state, and that like basically China's strength, but also its weakness is that they're trying to engineer like all of these social problems and stuff. And he's a representative of like kind of the westernized Chinese person who comes over to the US and is basically immediately becomes part of elite circles and is really good at, like he had an interview with Ross Douthat a couple months ago. And like he has that affect of being kind of like, oh, like, let me explain China to you and all that stuff, which I've met a lot of people like that, I feel. But there's a narrative, I think, in the West that I've noticed, which is like the two camps, let's say, that certain Western intellectuals will try to categorize in China as like, oh, what you would call maybe the materialist engineering camp of part of the Chinese elite versus like a more dissident camp of like humanistic concerns of like people. The narrative is that, oh, there are people in China who are dissatisfied with the almost like over hyper development, economic development, and that they're almost like the narrative is that there's these dissidents in China who are basically more influenced by like Western liberal democracy, but they want to inject more of a humanistic approach into China. But it's a kind of reframing of kind of the older propaganda narratives, I think, about China in general. But it's like, I think Zhang Guowei is very interesting in that way because he's not an apologist for the West or for Western liberal democracy, and is arguing for China's own model of development, but is also interested in, from what you guys are describing and what I've picked up on, like it is interested in like basically what is the moral and civilizational fabric that ties China together that should be part of China's unfolding historical development in the future. But I think Zhang is in that way, he represents something that I think is really not captured at all by any of the Western narratives about what Western elites imagine about basically the kind of competing camps within Chinese like intellectual society, especially.
Yeah, I feel like the feeling that I get is that there's basically a maturity to the level of thought and discourse. Because like even looking at the China Academy, I feel like it takes a lot to, I think, overcome like basically like a century of humiliation, being told that like the white man knows best, that is the vision of modernity. And I feel like in some ways, I feel like the Chinese way has been very humble to say, okay, like let us actually learn what we can. But now I feel like the terms of exchange or the way that China or like thought and people are actually like, I guess, participating in this world is saying like, we come as equals. Like, yeah, we come as part of the human family. We don't come with like shame or like needing to debase ourselves, but can we actually like speak as equals? And can we actually learn like from each other? And those are the only terms on which like basically any future could be. And I feel like it is kind of like, okay, like this is what it's going to be, take it or leave it. And I feel like I think that confidence is pretty important because like Jeremiah's saying, I feel like there are a lot of like Asian Americans who still want to interpret like China for the West or say like, oh, like, yes, the China that we need to know is like the people who want to become still Western or the people who feel inferior still. And yeah, I just think that it means a lot to try to navigate that, because I don't know, part of it was even thinking about the fact that China does have a lot of diversity or a lot of rich discourse, or like basically has a rich like domestic politics of like, how do you govern the country? What is the future going to be? What do we see as our values? What is civilization? What is our future? And I feel like it's like both positive and negative that I feel like Americans, like, we don't really know. Because on the one hand, it's not our business to interfere or to say that we should know and like dictate what's going on. But then on the other hand, I feel like something is lost by not being able to learn. And so I feel like that's partially why I think like you speaking with Ivy and also like having this perspective is important.
I know we're like pretty much at time, but I think like one thing I just wanted to emphasize again is the world historic role of the Chinese people in particular. And this is why I think it's going to be important for us to introduce Du Bois to Zhang Weiwei, because that's the worldview that's going to help him see, you know, I mean, he's more of a social scientist from the level of systems and institutions and nations, more so than the people. I think I could be wrong, but I just know we really have something that is going to be so important, I think, for the Chinese experiment. I also debated saying this earlier, but now that we're at the end, I just really want to say it as a friend to everybody at this table. But it's like a short story that I think showed us a lot about the Chinese people and the Chinese state. And it was in Beijing when we decided to go get massages one day. And it's because like we had so much stiffness in our upper backs and necks and everything. And honestly, it just shocked me how profound of an experience it ended up being, because we chose a clinic that's actually called a blind massage clinic. And I wasn't aware of this until we looked it up later. But China's state, I mean, truly, China's state creates a role for everybody in society, including the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. And it's very nonviolent in that way. I think it's also a response to the mistake of the Cultural Revolution. But a blind massage clinic is a type of clinic that employs mostly blind people who are encouraged to go into massage therapy as a profession because they have an extra sensitive sense of touch. And in fact, people will seek out that type of expertise. But it was a very intimate experience because they did it's not soothing massage, it's therapeutic massage where you're releasing the knots in all of your muscles. And the blind man immediately felt Albert's back, and then he felt mine, and he said, both of you should get bonal adjustion, like, which we had never done. But we were like, hey, like, sure. And Albert was like, I was like, yeah, do me. And then he popped up. It's because I have scoliosis, and then Albert has bad posture. But it was so funny because when he was adjusting me, I mean, it's highly sensitive work because you're like adjusting fast twitch muscles so that they fall back into the correct place so that your bones are better aligned. And he'll pull very quickly on different parts of your body. And there was one point where he grabbed my foot, and he's a blind man. And he starts like getting ready to pull it. So you're lying down, he's pulling in and out. He was like, he was trying to pull my foot. But instead, he just pulled my sock off. And we both laughed so hard. And then he tried to put my sock on after me. And like, dude, I'll never forget that because like, that's the type of sweetness that a society that's ordered by love makes possible.
Yeah.
And when we were leaving, he said to us like, come home often when you can.
Yeah.
And like, it's nothing less than a blood relationship from the start. And that's China's human achievement. It was just so funny. And then what was so funny is he would adjust me and then he would stick my arm out. And then because he's blind, like when he tried to walk past me, he would hit my arm.
You forget her arm was still out.
He hit it, he's like, oh. And then I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, it's okay. It's like, it's kind of embarrassing, you know? But like, it was just unbelievable, you know? You get more human expression and more human bondage. That's love flowing freely in a society. And that's just one example out of many that we could share. But we were nervous because we didn't really have family. Albert has a distant relative, but I mean, we found our family. It's Chinese people, you know. Keep on the slug. Okay, I'm done.
Do you think next Saturday we could continue this and Albert and Michelle could further develop this? Because I think the lessons for the struggle here Because I think what you all are saying is China is more than China now.
Yeah.
It's not just China's economic development. And I know Adam Tooze and Jeffrey Sachs, they're so overwhelmed and impressed with China, but only from a material standpoint and no
Right.
relationship to the ideological development
Right.
and spiritual development of the U.S. people.
Yes.
So maybe we should continue this.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna read some comments because I think people really appreciated your report. Bambala said, indeed, China is great, and it's a good point describing the vulgar, exploitative consumption of the USA, and that it's important to see poverty as a problem of society, not an individual disease. And says, yeah, this is great information from China. Brother Gregory Muhammad said, peace and blessings, Saturday Free School family. Just joining after being out on the street, engaging our people with the Final Call newspaper and words of hope. I'm pleased to hear the report from Sister Michelle's and Brother Albert's trip to China. The hand heart emoji. And then someone named Anilkar CT says that it's the capitalist US versus the socialist China project. And then a Mao quote saying that China has stood up. Says Mao predicted and set the goal of China surpassing US production by the 15th five-year plan. China has done it. They set the goal and achieved it. They did see it, and the West has its eyes closed. And then Bambala says to call the West intellectual is pretty debatable. Colin had said, very impressive perspective on China. Thanks for sharing. Kari also said, thank you, Michelle. David Ball says, my professor was a personal guest of the Cuban government. He stayed with Huey in his flat. Huey told him that the last thing he'd ever do was to kill Eldridge Cleaver. My professor reminded him that the revolution is not a personal vendetta. And then Milkar followed up and said, in China, they see a real genocide in Gaza, and at the same time, they see the West continue to lie about a fake genocide in Xinjiang. And the US is spending $1.6 billion over the next 5 years to promote anti-China propaganda. And then says, the path to communism is superior to the exploitation of capitalism. And then cites Gabriel Rockhill's article or book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism. Will Red, 73, says that it's profit over morals in the US. And then they are, in the comments, people are talking about this idea that no man is an island, I think in relation to this idea of the human family, talking about it being an African proverb. David Ball says, so ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And then people thought that the anecdote was both funny and moving. David Ball says, when you can raise a population to increased humane levels equal to the population of the US, what is there left to say? No country in history ever achieved such a wonderful feat. What can you say to that? And then Jahan says, amazing story about the blind massage therapist. The state is truly judged by how it treats and develops the full capacity of, quote, the least of these. It gives us hope for the future of world humanity's development.
It's like that Gandhi saying where he's like, when you look at the history of humanity, one way of telling history is to tell it through the wars that have happened.
Yeah.
But the other way to look at history is to ask, like, where were all those places where the people were non-violently making history, but it's not told that way. And I think China's development, like, I mean, I know this is said a lot, but like the ability to actually raise all of those hundreds of millions of people from poverty without, not through the path that the West took, which was the path of slavery and colonialism and war, has to be seen as such a remarkable achievement. And to be told with the kind of drama and honesty that I think it deserves.
It's the all humanity struggle is being concretized.
Yes, it is.
You know, it's so much. We have to do this next week and just. I'm sorry, I wouldn't do it.
Okay, well, I know we're past time. We'll continue this very moving and important discussion next week. But we thank all of our listeners on the YouTube. We enjoy your comments, and we look forward to being back next Saturday for another session.